Welcome to the Simply WoW podcast, where we discuss WoW simply. Today we'll be focused on Mythic Plus. I'm Meeps, and today I'm joined by Rise,
Hey there, how's it going?
Otter,
Hi.
he's fine, and Cappy.
Hi.
And we'll be talking everything Mythic Plus, if Otter survives. From its
not go according to plan. Oh my god. It burns. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
From its inception in Legion to each BFA season, and finally our predictions for Shadowlands based on the information we have available. Before we begin, Otter and Cappy, you guys want to give us a bit of your WoW background?
Sure. My name is Otter. I like to pull raid bosses with Army of the Dead. I also like to dot things that have incapacitates on them, and to this day, after 2 years, I still, for the life of me, cannot figure out what cleave is.
Perfect.
So
That's classic.
yeah, there's a backstory to all three of those, but long story short, Rise, the guy above, introduced me to WoW when Destiny didn't really go according to plan. It kind of fell off. He introduced me to WoW. I came in as a healer, and that was when he was in Perdition, I believe, at the time. And then I stopped playing. I don't really remember why I stopped. But then I came back during Antorus, and Jay and Rise are like, yeah, we don't need a healer. We need a DPS. So I went to play DK and started off playing the game as Unholy because I'm a masochist and hate myself. And I was the bar for licking the floor. Like, janitors looked up to me kind of thing. It was pretty bad. And after some time going into research, I became a decent player. Come BFA, we did pretty well until Zekvos guild fell apart. I went with Rise to Resistance, and then real life came up and I had to stop. Came back for Ashara and had a really bad raid experience where I was used for farming loot. I didn't like it, so I kind of really quit. And then Rise came back to me in Nyalotha and was like, hey, we really need a decent DPS. I said, okay, which is ironic because I ended the tier as a fucking tank. So, yeah, that's my story.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you. Did you prefer tanking in Nyalotha, or would you have been happier DPSing?
DPSing.
Well, thanks for taking one for the team then.
Well, the thing was, is I thought I would enjoy tank in raid as much as I would in Mythic Plus, and that's a fucking lie. Tanking in Mythic Plus is much more. There's much more complexity in it. There's more leadership, more responsibility, and you know how I love all those things. And then when it comes to raid, it's difficult to a point, but like once you hit that point, like there's no skill ceiling. It's like once you hit it, that's it. Like it becomes very simple after that and boring.
Taunt the boss at 3 stacks, don't get hit by the shit on the floor,
Yeah,
rip the ads,
There's nothing crazy I can do, man. It's not like, hey, let me taunt this, pop a Lightfoot, okay, pop an external on me, let me hop on this point, snap pull everything, and then like interrupt and stunt. Like, there's none of that. It's just like, let me walk the boss here. Okay, press defensive. Okay, death strike. And it becomes boring. But I've rambled enough. Gappy, what's your story?
Hi, I'm Cappy. I really like playing specs that are not good at Mythic Plus, but push really high keys. I mained a Shadow Priest this patch because I started in January, so all I know is 8.3. I pretty much just played Shadow Priest up to 3.2 KIO, and then decided to go to Resto Shaman up to about 20s. Was pretty much where I had stopped. So yeah, I haven't really played long, but I joined these guys as a Shadow Priest for raid couple months ago, so I haven't really played like a whole lot, but I definitely pushed some decently high keys with Shadow Priest, which was not the most enjoyable thing. Shadow Priest kind of sucks.
It was weird when the first time that I was talking to you and you're like, oh yeah, I'm really into Mythic Plus, and I thought, oh, Shadow Priest, he's probably doing some 15s, and I look at your WoW report and it's like, oh yeah, he just timed a 22 underwrought yesterday, and I'm like, holy shit, like, you're playing Shadow Priest and you did that? Like, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of fun almost crashing people's computers with the amount of ghosts that I get, but I definitely, I enjoyed it a lot. It just took a lot more out of me because keeping up Void Form while also not being hit by like 20 mobs, keeping it all dotted was a very aggravating playstyle. So
It's still a meme to me that day when we did that. I think it was a 21 Temple of Sethralis in the orb room, and you literally just dotted everything, and the screen was so purple I actually couldn't see the floor because there were that many apparitions.
I'm pretty sure if I didn't die to the lightning mob, Kiki's computer would have crashed because she said she hit like 3 frames at one point. So yeah, I mean it's a joke across a lot of high Mythic Plus Shadow Priests. Is just bigger polls means less frames for players. So that was one of the fun parts.
Well, on the topic of Mythic Plus, since that's the whole idea for this, and that's why we brought you guys on, because honestly, I think you guys are more well versed in Mythic Plus than either of us. Definitely me. I mean, I did Mythic Plus all the way back in its inception in Legion, which that's what I figured. I'd ramble on a bit about Legion Inception, but we won't talk too long about it. It's just the pitfalls, basically, that the changes they made from Legion to BFA. Rise, do you remember much of the Legion Mythic Plus?
Yeah, actually, I do. I started playing again in Nighthold after my very quick end with a previous guild in Emerald Nightmare. However, when I got in, the only real way that I could perform is if I went and did a bunch of Mythic Plus. So I found a couple raiders that were fine with me. One of our guys, Roland, he just swapped to Guardian Druid. We had his girlfriend, Day, doing Holy Priest. And then it was me, Zach, and one other guy. And we just hopped in. We did that for like 8 hours a day. Those times were a lot different than now, but as much as I remember of it, it was hard. It had very low barrier to entry. And then when you wanted to push, it got very, very difficult very, very quickly. In particular, around the 9 to 10 key jump was so significant. That's something we'll hit on a little bit more later. But it was really fun. It gave replayability value to the whole game as a whole. Being able to go into a specific dungeon, keep trying for loot, get better loot, and get raid equivalent loot felt really good, especially when, sometimes you get screwed off a raid loot, or if in order to compete, you have another option. It's not just, oh, I can't compete, I guess I don't get the spot in a raid team, and then I can't get the gear, and then you just fall into a perpetual hole. But there's definitely been some problems with it that we'll bring up as we go forward. But I think it was one of the best things in Legion that was added to the game as a faceline value that made people keep coming back to the game and made it so you could play it on a day-to-day basis more often.
And I think that's actually one of the most positive things I can say about Mythic Plus, because I see that for a lot of people, Mythic Plus is a major draw to the game. And so I think overall, then that means it's been a successful addition to World of Warcraft. But as you alluded to, some of those major issues with the beginning, how about the Maw of Souls runs?
Dude, that was the coolest thing. So, I remember the day that Legion came out and grinded really hard on my mage, and we were doing all the dungeons, and we unlocked Maw of Souls, and we went and did it, and was like, man, these mobs were pretty fucking rough. And then, the raid drops, and Mythic Plus comes out, and I think it was, the first week of Mythic, I saw a video, and it was like, you can do Maw of Souls in 2 pulls. I was like, what? No, you can't. And I watched the video. They all start, the tank pops potions, and, throws down an Ox Totem, pulls straight to the boss. He had... It was an Arcane Mage, a Demon Hunter, and a Rogue, and they just killed all the mobs at the boss. And I was like, what the fuck? This is insane! And there was, I think it was, a +7, which, the first week of Mythic was actually kind of hard back then. Yeah. But just, seeing those kind of things and knowing it's oh yeah, this dungeon is, a 12-minute dungeon. It's just 3 boss fights, there's really nothing in between, you just do huge pulls, yeah, there's a little bit of CC and nuance to it, but stuff like that was really, really interesting to see. And then when I went to the competitive scene, they just made it an 8-minute run. That was just even cooler to see.
Yeah, and the reason that Maw of Souls was so popular is it was just that. It was a super short dungeon, and in the beginning, Mythic Plus gave you an award. It awarded you gear and artifact power at the same amount from dungeon to dungeon to dungeon. So if you spent 30 minutes in a Halls of Valor, you would get the same reward as your 12 minutes in Maw of Souls. So what did everyone do? They farmed up Maw of Souls keys. Because why spend all that extra time in Halls of Valor when you can just speed through Maw of Souls? But that did get changed pretty quickly. I don't think it was changed until after the first major patch, though. I think it wasn't until 7.1.
Yeah, I think you have that accurate. I could be wrong, but that does sound about right. Yeah.
Do you remember if there were any affix combinations in certain dungeons that were ridiculous? Other than
Oh,
obviously
okay.
going from 9 to 10, going from no fortified or tyrannical to fortified or
Yeah,
tyrannical.
which that's something we'll hit on in a few minutes. But
Yeah.
my one that I hated most was, and I can't remember the name of the dungeon for the life of me right now. Maybe you'll hit it. The dungeon in Vel'Shara. That was the tree dungeon, and the first boss was the big tree, and then you know at the
Darkheart
very
Thicket.
end you fight the Darkheart Thicket. That dungeon with explosive was a nightmare. And it was only because there were like a couple poles going to the first boss that there were all these little fucking seed weed things, and they would all run out at the same time, and then it was just boom, 10 volcanic. And it's like, I literally do not have enough time to kill every single one of these because you couldn't tab target them. Like, there was a macro for a while, and I think it got patched in 8.2 where you could specifically target them, but that dungeon, just that first pull was like, oh god, okay, like pull slow, and then it's like you pull one mob and it's like, okay, we pulled 10 anyway. Just try
Right.
to live. Just pop defensive, spirit link, whatever you have. And most of the time it would be, okay, well we died, but we killed 4 of them, so we'll go do the next pull another time, and then we'll get it just slower. Also, Arcway, the dungeon where you were, underground doing the tunnels. The fact that it had randomness to it, it was nice on a week by week base where you could kind of track it. But specifically that dungeon with not Grievous. It was I think it was Necrotic, because there were a lot of mobs that were in the middle hallways between the elemental boss and then the crazy guy boss. There were a lot of mobs in there that had slows, and so it would just be like you get slowed, and then all of a sudden it spawns the one big ad that you're supposed to walk away from, or it blows up and kills you. And it's just like, okay, well you're slowed, and you have to kite, and now all of a sudden like someone randomly pulls threat, and then either the mobs one shot you, or you miss an interrupt because the tank has to run away and he's not a part of it. Stuff like that was a little bit difficult, but it was never unmanageable until you got to, the tens, in which case you had to put a lot more effort in.
I think
What about you?
for me, it was just skittish for the most part. I don't know if it was changed, but to me, it seems like it did get changed to where skittish is a lot easier to deal with now. Even though the threat tables have changed, the nerf to threat that tanks saw going into BFA. Even with that, I think skittish has gotten easier. I don't know why, but it seemed like skittish before would just drop threat. Not only would they stop gaining threat on the tank, but they would just completely drop it and target someone else. So for me, skittish used to be a really big pain unless I was on my hunter, so I could just misdirect it back.
Segueing off of that, the
Go ahead.
skittish is being deleted in Shadowlands.
Yeah.
It's no longer an affect.
Oh, I know. It's going to be so nice. Skittish was actually a huge problem, and a little bit more relevant in BFA before it got a little bit nerfed. I think it was an 8.2, no, 9, wait, 8, yeah, it was 8.2 that it got nerfed. I was thinking Shadowlands numbers.
Yeah.
But it's like, I remember there were times where you'd have like a crit class. Like at the times, Demon Hunters in Legion were crit classes. And you'd do like a big pull, and it was like, Demon Hunter, you can't I-beam. Why? Because you will crit every hit, and you will immediately rip threat, and you will get 10 melees, and you'll die. And then they'll all go back to the tank. I was like, that's really shitty. Like, but it was kind of inevitable. So with skittish specifically, it makes sense that some affixes make you play the game a little differently. But skittish was one where it was like it forced you to like sacrifice your own potential, not just play differently. Like you can interrupt, you can tab target to a volcanic, you can spread out when there's the little ground affect. I'm trying to remember what it's called, the one that interrupts you if you keep casting with it, that all range hate. But like that specific affix was pretty toxic in its initial carnation.
I will say that, like, with skittish, especially, like, for a while in BFA, it was a joke until 8.3, when everybody got their crazy, like, DPS corruptions, it became an actual fix again, because people were ripping threat off of non-prot warrior tanks. And it became a bigger problem again. We were like, hey, Fire Mage, can you not combust? Because you're just going to rip all the aggro off of everyone. We had that problem with Aru in a couple dungeons, but yeah, skittish became an affix again, which was kind of funny.
All right, and last thing I want to talk about with the Legion Mythic Plus is, what did you think of the Fortified and Tyrannical only in 10 and higher keys? There you
Oh
go.
man, with the biggest problem is it was just such an instant fuckfest of numerical value. It was like a 9 was manageable. Most groups, like you would see in the group finder, you'd type in that you're doing like a 10, and there would be like a million groups for 9s. And it was like, we're doing a 9. If it goes well, we'll try to do a 10. We'll try to push it. And that was like the big meme. It was like, when you get to 10, like the fact that you would be adding Grievous or Fortified at that moment was fucked. And just in case, Cap, your otter, if you don't know, the affix that was the 9 and 10, it was either Grievous or Fortified. So you didn't start it with that
Tyrannical.
2.
Tyrannical.
Yeah,
or Fortified.
Tyrannical, sorry. So it was like, all of a sudden, it went from, oh, this dungeon is 205% harder, bump up the key level, it's like 210% harder, whatever. And then all of a sudden, all of that numerical value is then multiplied by 30% for bosses. And it was just, you'd get to a boss, and it's like, oh yeah, I have every 9 timed with like a +1, +2. And then you get to a boss like, I don't think this is possible. Like, this is way too fucking hard. It's just such a weird normality of like, you hit this certain level, and then it just gets impossible. And like for Fortified, most dungeons were, especially in 8.0 or like 8.1, some dungeons when you hit a 10 just felt impossible. Like doing Court of Stars with Fortified, there were so many difficult pulls in there that each individual mob pull of 3 mobs would take you like a minute and a half. It was awful.
Or the last boss on Tyrannical.
Oh god, yeah.
With
when
his
you'd have
AoE.
the entire floor. Yeah, you'd
Yeah.
have the entire floor filled and you'd be in the corner. And then it'd feel like a raid boss encounter where you're hitting in rage. It was awful.
But yeah, I think that's one of the big positive changes from Legion to BFA. At first, I was against it because I liked the easy levels from 1 to 9 because you could just go in there and steamroll them. And then 10, it was like, oh, now these guys have health, so we have to do mechanics.
Mhm.
But over time, I grew accustomed and I realized that's a good thing that you don't hit that wall at 10, or if because they kind of move the target later in the expansion. 15 is what your minimum baseline Mythic Plus that you want to do. So
Yeah.
I think overall it was a really positive change.
If I can extend the question, I mean, since Cappy and I didn't really play much Mythic Plus in Legion, we do want to focus on Shadowlands. What about affix combinations in BFA? Because those things changed a little bit from Legion into BFA. And I think there were some affix combinations that were pretty bad. So, Cappy, without the obvious one that we will talk about later in the podcast, what would you say is your least favorite affix or affix combination?
Depends on what spec I was running. Shadow Priest was quaking. And then whenever I was on Resto, probably Grievous. I just hated Grievous as a Resto Shaman because it took so long to get a heal off that it was like, if people started stacking Grievous, it got really bad. Bursting was never a problem as Resto though, so, but definitely quaking for Shadow. I hated having to stop casting as a Shadow Priest.
Okay.
Says every caster ever.
Yeah, for real. Well, I mean, Otter, since you brought up the question, what is your most hated current affix?
It's not a current affix, it's the combination of the 2 affixes. And it is the week where it is explosive and bolstering. Fuck you. I hate that week. That week is
rough.
so bad. And I don't want to go too off into a ramble, but quickly, right? That both affixes work the same, which is that you're targeting off of your priority target onto something else, right? So on explosive, you're aiming the high priority cast mob, and then you're swapping to explosive when it needs to die. And with bolstering, you're aiming the high HP target, and then swapping to the high priority cast mob to interrupt it. When you have both those affixes going off at the same time and you compound the tab targeting, the situation pretty much looks like this. Aim the high HP mob. An explosive's going off. Okay, got to go hit the explosive. Up, got to go interrupt. Up, got to go do another explosive. Up, got to get the interrupt. Okay, going to one more explosive. Hey, how's that high HP? Why is it 3 times bigger? And that's what happens. And you basically turn it into a mini boss, and it's so hard to manage properly. Even professionals that do 27s, 28s, when that week came, they were just like, this is my week off, man. I'm going on break. I'm gonna go to the beach. I'm gonna go have a drink. Like, they didn't touch Mythic Plus that week. But the cream de la crop of that week was that you would say to yourself, hey, we got the mobs through. The mobs are hard. It's fine. We'll just kill the bosses. Bosses are easy, right? Nope. Chuck Testa, it was a tyrannical week. So that was just absolutely terrible.
As far as the combinations, because I can only remember off the top of my head one specific combination from Legion. To quickly try to get past the topic. There was Raging, Necrotic, and Fortified. So you'd be doing like the optimal ways that you'd want to be pulling big packs. Fortified, you weren't able to pull big packs when you hit the 10. So that really, really sucked. And then on top of which, when you were pulling big, your tank always had to be able to kite. On some dungeons, that was a little bit unrealistic if you were doing larger pulls. And then the fact that you were trying to burn a bunch of these mobs down because you were doing big pulls, and all of a sudden it was raging, and your tank would get one shot right as the mobs were about to die, and then it would just be a wipe where it felt like a raid boss where it's like, okay, we're doing really good, and then like, quote unquote, you get to phase 2 where the mobs hit 30% health, your tank has to run away because it's dying, all the mobs are super buffed from multiple sources, and just, it was over. So I think out of all of them, that's the one I remember the most because it was like any trash-related dungeon was just a slog.
In the MDI, they actually did not run explosive bolstering at all. Like that was never an affix combination, but they did run necrotic raging, and that actually was the most hated affix combination in the MDI by all of them for exactly the reasons you said. Necrotic would build, and it would get to a point to where like, okay, now I don't receive any healing, and at that point, all of a sudden the ads are just like, yeah, now we hit twice as hard, and you don't receive any healing, and so that was the roughest part.
I gotta say, I know we'll talk about this a lot more later, but anytime that I see Tyrannical Necrotic, I have nightmares. That's one of the worst tweaks ever, because if you think enrage timers are bad, necrotic versions of it is the worst. If you don't kill the boss quick enough, it'll put too many stacks on your tank and you can't reset it. And it's probably one of the worst.
Unless you have a holy poly and then you just bop them.
Yep. What about you, Meeps?
I mean, anything necrotic. Really, from a personal standpoint, one FX is as bad as another. None of them really stood out, especially because I play ranged DPS, so it's just like, whatever, you guys deal with the affixes, I'm just going to shoot things. And even the ones that target ranged, I can move and cast without having to worry about them bothering me either. So for me, it was just, one bad day is as bad as another. I do think that, what was the one that stacked the healing debuff? Necrotic?
Necrotic, yeah.
Grievous or necrotic?
Oh, well, Grievous is the one where you get up to 5 stacks, and then it's just a dot that kills you, and you have to hit 90% HP.
Yeah.
Okay, necrotic.
Necrotic was by far the worst on its own affix to me, but at the same time, if you had a tank that knew what they were doing, they could just kite out and drop the stacks. And that was a tactic that was, like, especially people got better at later on.
Yeah,
Necrotic was not a pug week, though. If you tried pugging your tank for Necrotic week, you were going to lose that key.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, even segueing off of that, I know we'll talk about it more when we get to the Mythic affix part, which is going to take probably a majority of our podcast tonight. But like, one of the things I hate about Necrotic and Grievous, but Necrotic mostly, is the fact that maybe it's personal because I played this class, but like the fact that Necrotic legitimately just like hamstringed one class so much harder than any other tank class was just so bad. Like the fact that specific affixes really hamstring a specific class rather than the group feels bad, man. Like, we'll talk about it later, but yeah, like being a blood DK on Necrotic week is not a good time.
I mean, we can talk about it now. I was going to go from the seasonal affixes and see how the seasonal affixes mixed in, how they changed up the dungeons. And, while we're at it, we can see how they interacted with the usual affixes.
Quick hot take. The two best things that they ever did relating to Mythic Plus. The first one was the removing of Fortified and Tyrannical from the level 10 affix. The second thing was seasonal affixes. Because it gave it just that much more replayability factor. The cool thing with them is that they dynamically changed keys.
Seasonal effects are great because they're not like just this big negative problem. It's a negative and a positive together that creates this really cool dynamic. I mean, like, that was one thing I brought up like a while back whenever you guys were talking about seasonal affixes. Things like, at least like this season's with Awakened, you have the ability to skip mobs just by going in the obelisk, but your negative is you have to kill the boss. So I think it's really cool. It adds this nice dynamic where you don't have to bring a rogue to every single dungeon. So there's that kind of whole thing.
Just one question.
Just for that one tier.
Yeah.
What was the upside to Beguiling? Was it
Yeah,
any
Look, I can't help you there.
I was gonna say some of the affixes were cool. I don't think they were all a positive thing,
Yeah.
but having them different was really good. So when Awakening was a thing, and it was like, okay, we now have to scale our dungeons based on pulls hitting like 20, 40, 60, 80, 100% trash count. Like that was really interesting to see how the dungeon changed, corresponding to beguiling. Like you had to dynamically change the dungeon. Like there were different pulls, different orders, different positioning. When there was the Ashara one with the emissaries everywhere, you had to understand which emissary did, and you had to play around it. So it just changed everything that you were doing. Different areas you had to LOS. You could skip mobs with the current affix, which I think is probably the best seasonal affix that they did because it does have a plus side for some keys. But most importantly, every season dungeons were different. From season 1, you ran junkyard or not junkyard. You ran mecha or the motherlode a specific way, and then over time people refine their strategies based on that affix. And then when the next one came out, it's like, oh well, we can just do this totally different thing. We can pull it 100% different. Like these mobs that we never touched before, now we're pulling the entire front. Or during the Ashara one, well, you can't pull it at the front. Now we have to quickly slog through and sneak through to kill the one Ashara ad, and then you pull the front. Or you skip the first part entirely, and then you pull all the ads at the end because there's no like Ashara minions there. So every single one of them had like a special nuance that made it unique for every season, which I think is like the most explorative thing that they've done, and probably, again, hot take, one of the best things that they have ever done for Mythic Plus.
Well, yes, good. But now let's build into Shadowlands with Prideful. What do you guys think about Prideful?
Prideful.
I have
like in every way possible. I don't know how I can see it any way negative, and from what people are talking about it makes every dungeon so much better.
I don't think it's going to be negative at all. I actually have an Excel document up here with every affix and every change they're making. So if anybody has any questions, just let me know. But yeah, I don't see Prideful being bad at all.
For the viewers, really quick, do you have the actual definition of Prideful, just in case people that are watching don't have it or don't?
Correct. Know? Yes. So Prideful, for every 20% of the dungeon that you complete, a mob will spawn called Pride. You will kill it. When you kill it, you will get a buff called Prideful. It will give you 100% damage for the next minute.
That is going to be so abused.
That's what I was saying. Okay, so in my thoughts for this, right, I said I think it'll be fun in lower tier Mythic Plus, right? I think there's like people are going to have fun with it just to see how their numerical values go. But for higher keys, this is going to be meta defining. Yep. This is going to be abused. The bad thing I see about it is that if a team wipes with a Prideful buff against a boss or a big pull and they wipe, the key could be dead. Like they can't do that key anymore, right? Or like on time or doing for like plus 29s, plus 30s without that buff. And the issue is that beforehand, if you failed a big pull on a plus 28 or plus 29, you could just redo that pull. Even though you couldn't complete the dungeon on time, you could get practice doing that pull over and over and over again until you got it right. Well, now with Prideful, you only get one shot. I mean, it's the fucking Eminem song. You got one shot, one opportunity, like, and that's how it is. So I feel like in high tier Mythic Plus, this is going to be extremely stressful and very meta defining.
Well, and oh, go ahead, Cappy.
I was going to say, the one thing that I do really like about it is the 5% mana every second for healers. That's one of the best things ever, especially if you're running Resto Shaman, because I can just press Chain Heal over and over and over again and not even care about my mana during the fight. So that's kind of nice to see.
Yeah, that addition is very important because, it's one thing to just give everyone damage or, increase your healing. But, that only can go so far. So having it scale for every class in every way. And, some classes like Arcane Mage, not only do they get the damage bonus, but they get the mana and they can spam. Like, some classes are going to be super enabled. And I really like to think that, it will really define the high tier pushing. But it's going to be so fun to hop into, a 10, with all your buddies and, this is easy content, quote unquote. And you just suddenly Prideful procs and just go crazy, guys. Let's see what we can do. Just fucking go nuts. And, if we lose Prideful, we're on a 10. We'll just, pick it up. But, there might be a scenario where you like pull the first 20% and then you do just a fucking insane pull on a dungeon if there's enough trash, and then by the time it runs out you hit another 20%, you re-get the buff, and then you just chain those together. It could be really, really gnarly.
Yeah, so one of the strategies I was thinking to myself was that like what they're going to do is they're going to get to the first 20%, they're going to receive the buff, they're going to pull 18% of the trash into the boss, and they're going to blow it the hell up for like MDI, right? And then they have 3% trash left. Well, that's cooldowns, right? So they go into like a very small pack. They get to 20%. Their cooldowns are still cooldowns. They're hitting the prideful mob. Their cooldowns are still cooldowns. Boom, they get prideful. Now their cooldowns are off, and they repeat it. And they do that 5 times throughout the dungeon, and they complete the dungeon in 10 minutes. Because 100% damage and pulling 8 mob groups, like arbitrarily, this will go into a subject we'll talk about later, but like the damage increase is just so exponentially ridiculous, and it's going to be so abused. It's going to be fun to watch MDI with this affix. It's going to be really entertaining.
I'm sure we're going to see that one team that does something completely crazy. Like we'll see the standard craziness that like you just brought up, and then one team just blows it all out of the water. Like, oh well, that's the 5-head move right there.
Do you know if you're allowed to spawn multiple pridefuls at once? Because I know it's every 20%, right? So if you killed like 60% somehow in one pull, would it spawn 3?
That is a good question. I actually have not been able to find that out. I don't know if like numerically you can do that. I think the problem is even with the 100% damage buff, remember there needs to be a way to survive 40% of a trash pull. Like there needs to be a way to survive that, and with capped AoE and with people being low level and not having the best mythic gear levels, I don't think that they can reliably like pull 40% of the dungeon on a +10 to test that out, because no one said anything about that yet.
Yeah, definitely. I was just wondering because like for what I'm looking at least right now, it's an extra 30% damage. So I was wondering if like you killed 2 or 3 of them that just stacked, and you could somehow blow up the final boss just instantly. I don't know. It was just some idea I had.
Dude, could you imagine like an arcane mage having spell steal with like 3 prideful buffs?
Yeah, no, I'm good. Thanks, though.
Oh my god.
Wow, we're already back to BFA numbers.
Right? So going off of that, let's talk about the affixes that are getting removed. So skittish and teaming are actually getting removed. They're no longer affixes in Shadowlands. I'm okay with this for the reasons why they're doing. Here's my guess, right? So teaming caused a lot of pulls to be exponentially harder, and it drastically changed routes. So example, the what are they called? The Dervish Devils in Temple of Sethralis on Fortified. Like you had to kill those to spawn the boss, but that pack on Fortified and a plus 23 and above was impossible to do without 3 Beastmaster Hunters. Like you legitimately could not do it.
If you don't mind me segueing on that exact thing, I have a wonderful story I think I told you guys about, but I did a 22 on my Resto Shaman on that pull, Fortified teaming with the Dervishes. I pulled almost 300k HPS on my Resto Shaman, Spirit Link, everything, and I still couldn't keep them up long enough because there was so much damage going out. I was like, whoever designned these mobs and the idea that teaming needed to work with them obviously has never done Mythic Plus.
Yeah. So like that was the main problem with it, and I feel like it's okay that they're taking that out to create more consistency and not to have that problem of stacking mobs together. Skittish, I know why they're taking it out. And it's for exactly the reason that Meeps was talking about. Like, a beginning, it was a problem. Skittish was okay until the borrowed power systems allowed the DPS to outscale the tank aggro rate.
Yeah.
Right? And so this meant that, like, when you pulled big pulls, it did not matter how much damage the tank could output. The DPS output was so ridiculously high, hello, Fire Mage, that they would just rip threat. And there was nothing you could do about it. So they had to run a specific essence that allowed them to hold aggro for 6 seconds. And you would use that about 5 seconds into the ignite cycle while they were stunned, because during stuns, the ads could not like change aggro. They were building threat, but they could not change aggro while they're stunned. So what you would do is you permanently stun them, and then right at the time when they got up, the tank would use that essence, and then the Fire Mage would burn them. But like, how much coordination does that take to like be able to be played on a standard, average Joe team? So Skittish being removed is totally okay in my opinion. I don't think it works well. I think this is a very good indication that Shadowlands is going to be really going far into the borrowed powered systems and DPS scaling being much higher than the tanks.
Skittish proved that Prot Warriors were OP even more during Corruption because the only tank that could hold aggro from all of them specifically was Prot Warriors. They could just continuously shield slam the ground and nobody would do anything or whatever it was. But yeah, like I think I watched like an MDI fire mage pull over 100 or 800k DPS at one specific second and still didn't pull aggro off the Prot Warrior.
Yep. So. And that was because the ads were stunned. The ads can't change target if they're stunned. Once they become unstunned, they can change. But if you can just keep them permanently CC'd, then hey, Fire Mage, go have fun. So, do you have any thoughts on that, Mr. Rise or Meeps?
I'll let you take it first, Meeps.
Oh, I was just about to look up my image. I don't do Mythic Plus.
You really do not do much.
I think that because Skittish is either a non-issue or a real issue, unlike pretty much every affix, it's fine to be removed because, like we were saying before, the corruption scaling went insane. It was basically a non-issue for most of BFA. So it's just, all right, we only have 2 affixes this week instead of Skittish. And also, teaming, I am so glad it's gone. If they would have kept it, they should have at least changed the teaming mobs to add to the mob counter more than they do. Do they even add to the mob counter? Because it seems like if you're on a teaming week, you're going to kill a lot more mobs.
Correct.
The mobs just are scaled down a little bit more, so every single mob counts less.
Yep. Yeah,
so it not only does it add mobs, but it also reduces the mobs percentage for it. But the thing is that the ads added are not equal to the rate at which the ads count percentage. So you actually do legitimately have to kill more trash. It's not equal for both.
Well, I mean, you might be able to. I can't think of a specific example, but there's a couple dungeons where you have to pull more like packs because there's not enough percentage within the packs you normally would pull, even if there's more mobs in them in the first place.
Yeah, King's Rest and Freehold.
I was thinking King's Rest, and then Freehold.
Motherload works the same way as well. So my take on that really quick. My biggest problem is the fact that Skittish would only, like in the worst case scenarios, was more effective or like worse for some classes. Like you can make an argument and say, oh, well, something like Quaking, yeah, that is really like ineffective against range classes, so we should get rid of it. But there were specific classes, for example, when I play an Ellie Shaman, I was doing a crit build, and the second that I would be doing massive crits, I would just be pulling too much damage, and suddenly I would pull. Same thing with Demon Hunters that were in Legion. You'd cast I-Beam, and you'd pull the whole pack. It was part of the game's design of like how they numerically generate threat. There were specific classes that were just really bad. Fire Mages suddenly burst 1 million damage, and they pull. Same thing with UDKs for a little bit at the end of Battle Desire Lore. They couldn't do some of those pulls that they were doing for crazy MDI strategies with Skittish because suddenly a UDK would pop off and then they would just pull threat and die instantly. There were ways against that, but for general standings, when some classes are incredibly affected by an affix, that affix either needs to be reworked or just kicked to the curb.
Hello, Necrotic and Grievous.
Yeah, and teaming, I'm okay with the concept of teaming. If they made it more balanced, if they, for example, if they split a mob in 2, like just make the mob the same percent. It's hard enough to say, okay, and instead of 1 interrupt, you have 2, and maybe you need to cleave a little bit harder, but that's not how it was on paper. Something like that could be cool. It could add more strategy. Maybe you have to CC packs, time your CCs, call it an interrupt rotation for certain mobs. But the fact that not only did it make it worse from a pull-to-pull basis, but it also increased the total amount of progress that you had to make over the entire dungeon, that's where it kind of just, something needs to happen with it. I don't care if it needs to go, but they need to do something with affixes like that. And they need to consider that going into the future with other affixes that they create.
Yeah, the problem being that the ads that they added were always priority ads. Like they never added like, just like, oh, the little ads, that they're not that much of a problem if their casts go off. Okay, whatever, cool. No, it was always an ad that had like some crazy high priority cast that you had to interrupt, which made it so that you could no longer pull 2 pulls instead of 1. You had to pull 1 pull, which you just slowed down your mob killing by 50%. And then you add on top of that like you legitimately just actually have to kill more trash because of the way they scaled the percentage killing. It was not a fun affix. I feel like it could be, but you mathed it wrong there. And there's another affix that you mathed all really wrong, and we'll get into that one later. But
yeah.
Well, speaking of,
I'm sure Cappy's gonna have a blast with that one.
Since we're on the topic of the changed and removed affixes, do you have a list of the affixes and how they change from BFA to Shadowlands?
Yes, I actually have the complete list and all of the changes and everything and all of them. So let's go over the ones that are not changing at all first. All right. Or do you want to go over the ones that are changing?
Either one works.
All right, so the ones that are not changing at all are going to be Raging, Bolstering, Quaking, Necrotic, Fortified, and Surprise. Cappy's favorite one being Tyrannical. I think we'll save that one for last because I think Cappy and I both share the same opinion on Tyrannical. And
I will say technically Tyrannical did change, but
it did. But it was never the problem.
Right.
They fixed the problem that wasn't a problem. So, yeah. Raging not being fixed, I don't have anything against that. That's fine. I think Raging's a fine affix. I don't have any problems against it. Bolstering not changing, whatever. I feel like bolstering is like how the devs quench their thirst from the lower tier players' tiers. Because for lower tier players, bolstering is like the most nightmarish affix to deal with. But for high tier players, it's very manageable. People have done 26s and 27s with bolstering.
There's an exception. Playing with a Shadow Priest on bolstering is one of the worst decisions you can make because on Siege of Borealis, you multi-dot everything, and Siege of Borealis is really bad because if the small mobs die, you end up bolstering the marksmen so high that they one-shot everybody. We had that issue when we were on like a 23 siege one time. So I think bolstering is definitely dependent on who you're with and what spec they're playing.
That is very true, right? Like there are specs that like legitimately just like they can't what is it? They can't swap from AoE to single target smoothly enough to really be able to manage that. So for like Beastmaster hunters, they could just swap from Beast Cleave to Kill Command, and it would make it very manageable. But for a class like an Unholy Death Knight, even Frost Death Knights, Shadow Priest, Elemental Shamans, stuff like that, like swapping instantaneously from an AoE perspective into a single target perspective was really hard to do, and because of that, it made pulls a lot harder. The other ones that are not changing are Quaking. I never had a problem with Quaking at all. I was a melee, and like I was next to the tanks and other melees, and I still never had a problem with Quaking. Maybe I'll feel the pain with Quaking when I has a ranged DPS because it'll interrupt some of my cast or something. I don't know. Maybe we'll see, but I never really had a problem with Quaking.
Even though I have a strong seething hatred for Quaking, it shouldn't be changed anyways. It's an affix that's perfectly fine. It affects both melee and range, so I think it's great. I'll always hate it as a ranged, but still.
Just put it out there. I'll always hate it, but
the other affix that isn't changing is going to be Necrotic. Well, it's rest in peace, Blood DKs. That's all I can say, man. Like, sucks. It sucks that they are legitimately just hamstringing a specific tank class. Now, there are ways as a Blood DK to play around it, which is the same way that other tanks do, but we can't do anything immediately. Like, we can't group the mobs at all, and so it just makes it hard. I think in high tier, it's not going to be that much of a problem unless it's combined with another affix, but in low tier, you're going to feel the pain. As Cappy said, Necrotic is one of those affixes where you cannot pub the tank.
Yeah.
There's certain affixes that definitely make pugging bad, and Necrotic's one of those for
Yeah,
and
for
that's
sure.
that's one thing we really didn't go too much in depth on is there are different levels of Mythic Plus, like the different groups that do the Mythic Plus. If you're pugging, pushing, or the MDI, that covers most of the people doing Mythic Plus. So
Yeah.
that's something to consider whenever we're talking about different aspects of Mythic Plus. Is
Yeah.
how necrotic is bad for pugs, but it's not really that big a deal unless you're blood decay if you're pushing or in the MDI.
I mean, even in higher tier, it's not that bad for blood DKs because of the way you play it the same way that any other tank would play it. It's really not that bad when you're a good tank. It just isn't. You can use the utility of your team. The thing is
Right.
that as a blood DK in lower tier, you cannot depend on your team to help you slow or mitigate or mob control that pull, and therefore you are getting hit by those ads, and you have no mitigation other than healing, and necrotic nullifies your healing. So for lower tier, it really hamstrings the blood DK.
To be honest, pugging Mythic Plus to sometimes feels like the game just added 4 more mobs to the dungeon and you're soloing
Right.
it. People
Sometimes.
suck so bad at Mythic Plus to some degree, and being a tank and a healer is even worse because you can't rely on people to do anything useful at all, and it sucks. But things like necrotic are a good point to that. Grievous is another one. Grievous got changed, so I mean we can talk about that whenever. But Grievous was a really bad one for healers because some healers would freak out and then they'd let people die. So
Yeah.
Well, the biggest problem with pugging, to obviously address the elephant in the room, is you never know what you're gonna get. Unless you make your own group, you hop into a group and you never know what to expect. You don't know if the healer is going to be choking on Grievous, or if you look at it and you're like, oh, well, maybe I haven't played Holy Priest. Is Holy Priest good on Grievous? I don't know. Is Holy Priest good on Bursting? I don't know. So you have to kind of, if you have the knowledge, it helps you get into a group. But every single time that I've talked to people, they're like, oh yeah, I just pugged, and I was like, well, your process for getting into those pugs, what'd you do? And it's like, I just joined a group. They had a key, so I joined. It's like, well, maybe you weren't successful because of that is how you went about it. So there's a little nuance to that specifically that we can talk more about if you guys have opinions on that. But
yeah, Mythic Plus is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get.
Yeah.
But it's usually going to have an insect in it.
I'd love to get into IO at some point during this podcast with how toxic, but how much I love IO. So
Yeah, no, we'll
very
definitely,
toxic, but I
we'll
want
definitely
to.
get to that. This is definitely the longest subject that we're talking about, just because there's so many freaking affixes and what they
Yeah.
change. So the other affix that has not changed is Fortified. I have no problem with that. I never had a problem with Fortified. I think Fortified's a fine affix. It's a static buff, great, cool, whatever. I understand the problems with Legion, like the +9 to +10 really felt like a +9 to a +13 because of Fortified. But right now in the current tier, Fortified is not that much of an issue. It never was that much of an issue. Does anyone else feel like it's that big of an issue?
Also, I think it is not an issue, but I want to point out something specific is that, in comparison to the other buffs, some of those are, I would say game changing, or you want to change how you're going about your dungeon pulls or doing things. The nice thing about Fortified, it's just a flat buff across the board. It's a one-time thing. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to worry about it. If you've done a Mythic 0, all you need to know is that Trash is going to be a little bit harder. In comparison to the other affixes, it's such an easy gateway affix. And that's why I think it is so important that it's in that 2 slot. Because you hop into your first +2 and you're like, oh wow, these mobs are a lot harder. Or, Tyrannical, which we'll get into later, I don't think it's necessarily balanced. But when you hop in, you're like, okay, bosses are harder. This is what I have to look forward to this week, or with this kind of key. So it's a great entry-level affix. It's perfect.
I love Fortify because it helped me as a Shadow Priest because you have longer to ramp up for the next pack. That was one of the best part about Fortified was when my group went in, we were like, we pull decent, we grab a decent pack, you ramp, and then we pull a massive pack, and because it was Fortified, we didn't have to do 2 packs of ramp. It was 1 pack. So that was really, really nice. And Fortified, again, I'm with you, Rise. It's a wonderful way for you to walk in and you're just like, okay, thanks, have more health. I feel like this dungeon's a little bit different now. And that's nice.
Segueing off of that, I think the next affix feels the same way when you're doing +0s to +15s. I think this next affix really doesn't fucking matter for low tier. But the problem is that the scaling for Fortified and mob HP and the scaling for boss HP is different. Whereas each time the keys go up, it exponentially increases. the rate at which it increases is lower for mobs than it is for bosses. And then the boss also gets 40% bonus health. So my notes for Tyrannical, though it has no changes, is fuck you, Blizzard. Fix yourself.
Look, real quick, I gotta go on my rant.
Go for it, dude. Have fun.
Okay, Tyrannical is one of the worst. Okay, look, Shadow Priest is known for their ability to do boss damage really well because it never drops off. The problem with it is Tyrannical is so fucking garbage. There's a couple of reasons why Tyrannical is garbage. One, your ability to get through a Mythic Plus is based on timing and adaptation. It's not really like a whole lot of anything else past a certain point. Timing a dungeon with Tyrannical bosses, especially certain ones, is too hard. There are certain bosses that last way too long on a 20 key that you just, it's like, what are you doing with your life? The second thing is like Kragmaw. Let's say like certain bosses like Kragmaw, right? You go into an Underwrite, you're on a 20, and you're like, let's do Kragmaw. My group, almost every single time, on 2 tantrums, on your 3rd tantrum, everybody knew you were dead because your healers did not have the cooldowns and you did not have the defensives to make it through your 3rd tantrum, and that meant that you were most likely done. King's Rest was another good one that was really pointed out for being a terrible Tyrannical dungeon because I think it was the first boss on a 23 or actually 23 Fortified. The dot would already be doing about 250k DPS per tick. At a Tyrannical, I think it was 350 something on a 23. You were half healthing people per tick. And certain healers can't deal with that. So Tyrannical overscaled bosses so much that they were doing so much damage or they were just too long and would not let you time at all. And it felt like a slog for some bosses. You want to have fun fighting that boss, dodging things. You're just kind of sitting there beating on the boss, and you watched him do the same mechanic 9 times now.
It also forced levels of perfection in terms of mechanics that like weren't needed before. Like you could mess up somewhere else, but like it wouldn't destroy the entire fight. And the example I have for this is like try doing a plus 27. Like I did a plus 24, and it was just bad. But try doing a plus 27 Tyrannical Captain on Freehold, the very first boss, right? The powder shot cannot be dodged, and it will one-shot any of your DPS. So the way you get around this is that there's a spot next to the egg nest, right, where you can actually LOS it and it won't do damage. So you look at the timer and you move behind it, and then it goes off and it doesn't hit you, though it shoots in your direction, and you come back and you do your DPS. This works. It's great, but it depends on one thing, is that the range DPS or the healer that's baiting those poop shots, if they mess up one time and that poop shot gets launched onto the boss and the tank has to move the boss, that's the only spot on that whole arena that you can LOS that black powder. And if he moves the boss, now your DPS are going to get one shot, and it completely kills the fight.
Yeah. Another one that I do want to point out is a healer one that's way impossible to do is Sisters. 23 Tyrannical Sisters was one of the worst experiences I've had. I think Kiki is in chat, and she said, there's so much damage going on the 2nd Sister. Even if you're moving, the dot is just so big, and the amount of stuff that's going out without consistent interrupts becomes a major problem that no healer actually wants to do it. It's pretty much what most people I think say going into a Tyrannical Waycrest is, can you kill Sisters on haste? No, get out of the dungeon. You will not time it. So that's why Tyrannical really pisses me off in so many aspects, because it makes things like Necrotic last way too long to the tanks. It's almost like an enrage timer. DPS are just like, what the fuck? I've gone through my cooldowns twice and the boss is still not dead. And healers have so much happening that it's just bad. So that's kind of where I'm having a really big issue and always have had with Tyrannical.
The thing with Tyrannical is that it affects mid-tier and high-tier, and anything like below a 15, it doesn't do anything. Like Tyrannical is really easy to handle on like a 15, but like once you get to 22s and up, it starts to become the worst affects in the game, and it only affects high-tier players. When you get that high, when the boss has 70 million HP, and you have 3 DPS. Okay, I want you to think here for a second. All right, Heroic Mott has 150 million HP. It takes 14 DPS, 5 minutes to bring that son of a bitch down, right? What are you going to do with 3 DPS against a target that has half as much HP as Mott? And how long is it going to take? 8-9 minutes. Okay, let's say it takes 9 minutes. Let's say 8. We'll be nice. Let's say it takes 8 minutes to bring down that boss. If there are 4 bosses, that means the bosses just themselves take 32 minutes to kill. If the dungeon timer's 35 minutes, what are you going to do? Clear 100% of the trash and awakening in 3 minutes? So that's the real problem with Tyrannical. I'm really sad that they're not fixing it. The way Dratnos put it is that it's like the sun and the moon of Mythic Plus. You know, when Fortified is out, the sun's out, you can go out, you can play, you can enjoy time, you can have a barbecue. It's all nice, right? And then the moon comes out with Tyrannical and it lets you know it's nighttime. It's like, oh, well, it's time to go to bed and wait until the sun comes up.
Tyrannical definitely is something that also forces the healer to do a lot more DPS than, I mean, most people know once you hit a 20 and above, your healer needs to start doing some form of DPS because things just last too long, unless your DPS are just absolute gods.
Yep.
So healers have to start doing DPS, especially with a Tyrannical. If your healer's just not doing any damage, you're not going to make it. And I mean, it's even with the tanks, right? Like if your tanks are doing less DPS, you're going to have these issues with Tyrannical. And that, again, goes back to your point where certain specs are just kind of kicked out on certain weeks because things like a Resto Shaman cannot do the DPS that things like a Holy Paladin can.
Or Resto Druid.
Resto Druid, Kitty Weaving. It's just like there's so much less chance of certain specs being able to play all because of one singular affix that starts so early in Mythic Plus in general.
Do you think Prideful will help alleviate that?
I think, well, the problem is that Tyrannical was never an issue in the first place for lower tier players. And I think that Prideful may alleviate a little bit of pressure for higher tier, but only to an extent. Because if it comes to the point to where, like, the reason we couldn't do Tyrannical was because, well, we needed more damage. And now in high tier, it's like, oh, now we have the Prideful. We can kill the Tyrannical boss. Yay, because we have more damage. Well, now it forces perfection. Because if you die and you wipe with the Prideful buff against a Tyrannical boss on a plus 27 and you wipe, that's it. Key's dead. There is no redoing it, you know? So I feel like Prideful helps, but it also inhibits in the same way in which it demands perfection from the group, even farther than it already demands perfection to do a Tyrannical boss fight.
Well, it seems that Blizzard decided to take Tyrannical to like some new heights that I honestly don't see why they went there. There's a boss in one of the Kyrian dungeons where it's the final boss and you get kicked down to a lane that you have to run to the end of and kill a mob to get back up to the boss. The problem is the healer can be thrown down there, and I've watched every time a healer get thrown down there, they die on what would be considered like a Tyrannical week. Or not even die, it just takes too long and their whole team dies. And I feel like they want to make mechanically harder bosses rather than to make Tyrannical not feel as bad, but it's becoming more of an issue because they're trying to make healers do stuff that they don't want to do. They don't want to sit there and have to kill an entire mob because some just can't. They don't have the DPS to do it. Resto Shaman's a good point at that. And they need to stop trying to make people do stuff that's making it worse.
Yeah, if you're gonna make a fight mechanically harder, then you need to add strategy to it. You can't make a fight mechanically harder and then add RNG to it. That's just ridiculous. So, yeah, I think we spent a lot of time on Tyrannical. I think you know our thoughts on Tyrannical. It's pretty shit, to say the least. So,
but speaking of healers DPSing, how do you guys feel about that? Would you rather that healers needing to fill a somewhat DPS role? Would you rather them not? Are you glad they do? Do you think that like Resto Shamans should have their DPS output buffed to be in line with the other ones?
I think that it's fine. I think it's okay to have classes like healers that have their niches in Mythic Plus the same way that rogues and demon hunters do, because rogues and demon hunters do not have the same power in raid or in PvP as they do in Mythic Plus. I think that it's okay for specific classes to have their niches and their forms of power in the different endgame content activities that are in World of Warcraft. I don't necessarily have a problem with it. I know that other people will, but that's just my opinion.
I'm on the fence about it because I think that having to do DPS is fine. It gives like a new level that healers have to do in Mythic Plus, because in raid it's a little bit different. Mythic raiding, everybody's taking so much damage, you can't really have time to DPS all the time.
Yeah.
In Mythic Plus, you're the only healer. You have to do it all yourself. So even if everybody's healed up, you have to have something to do. And doing damage is fine if they want that to be the specific thing, though, they need to give options to all of the healers. I bring up Resto Shaman a lot because I push decently high keys with them, and the only possible way that you can keep up with some of the DPS other ones do is Igneous Potential, which was a full Azerite trait you had to swap out just so you could get DPS going out. And they're getting rid of that in Shadowlands, obviously, because we don't have Azerite, and there's nothing that's taking place of it. And that's even worse, because people already weren't taking them in high keys because they weren't doing damage. Yeah, their healing and stuff wasn't great. We can get on that later, but like the problem is they don't do the damage that others do. We have to hard cast everything besides Riptide. That's a huge issue. And whenever you have DPS that you need to do, you don't have this time to throw up a rejuve and then kitty weave. You have to throw out your chain heal, which takes 3 seconds, and then during that time, now you have to healing surge your tank, and it's like, I don't have time for this. I have to get that insta proc from Lava Burst, and it's just a massive issue. Holy Priests have this problem too. Without Divine Star, well, what damage are you going to do? Smite them? Yeah, that does literally nothing. So
I agree, but I also have to point out that these issues that we're pointing out are only issues for like the top 2% of players for Mythic Plus, right? Like healers doing DPS doesn't really matter too much in a plus 15, let's be honest. Like it's not that big of a deal. These issues start to really come out and show and become significant issues when you start to do higher and higher and higher keys. But let's be honest, what RPG doesn't have that element where like all of a sudden the class differential starts to really peak once you get to higher? I mean, like Overwatch has it, Diablo 3 has it, StarCraft has it. Like every game on the planet has that aspect. But in terms of 95% of the population, I feel that Blizzard have done a relatively good job at closing the gap in class differences within Mythic Plus.
I think that can be skewed primarily, and I don't know because I just came back. Sorry about that. If it was if you've mentioned like the things that classes have, their actual kits, because sometimes a class kit can make one class feel stronger, even though numerically, yeah, they are kind of similar, and some classes that bring a certain thing get a little bit balanced out. Like the perfect example would be like a rogue. Yeah, a rogue's not going to do as much damage as a fire mage, but a lot of top tier, high key pushing groups will bring a rogue, because even though it's not going to pump as much damage, it does have a lot of unit control. There are some times where you're building a composition and you say, hey, it could be really good to have, a mage in this group. Or, if we need a mage, then let's bring a demon hunter for the spell power, and then we'll add another caster. So you also have to think about team composition in a lot of their, practice makes perfect kind of thing. But yeah, I'd say for general sense, if you're just looking at individually two classes, regardless of the group composition, I feel like they've done a fairly good job to balance the numerical differences between the amount of utility that a class can bring.
Yeah, the way that the topic that you're talking about is one that we're going to talk about later, which is how utility converts into damage. And that's a great segue to go into. But I want to stay focused on the affixes before we shift into that topic real quick.
And before we go anywhere, I would like to say the one thing you brought up is, having healers DPS only really matters to the top 2 or 3%. But this is a topic that's been brought up a lot lately. It's community perception. How many times do you think Resto Shaman has not been brought to a 15 pug because they're a Resto Shaman, even though they'd be fine healing it, even though like
that is a human nature problem and a community driven problem that I don't think can be solved, and we can talk about that later because that's going to bleed directly into the uncapped AoE perception. But yeah, that's just human nature, dog. Like plebs look at the pros, see what the pros do, and label that as the best thing to do, and if you don't play it, you're a scrub, even though like they forget that it's not the class that's good, it's the player that empowers the class, and they completely forget that aspect. And it bleeds down, and it causes a lot of toxicity into a lot of the player base. But we'll talk about that later.
I actually have a really good story just to throw onto that. I got a denied from an 11 on my 2.4k Resto Shaman who had finished a 20 version of the 12 key I was applying to because I was a Resto Shaman. I've done that key 8 key levels higher than what I applied to just to help out a friend, and they denied me. And I was like, I don't think those people understand what key difference means.
Yeah,
but...
I was trying to get a 15 done for a Toldagor. I have a 2-star 23 Toldagor done on my Frosty K, and I got denied because they wanted a lust. I was like, or you're out of your fucking mind. Like, I don't even, okay, anyways. So, going on to the other affixes, right? Now let's go to the new affixes. They're bringing in new affixes, right? So they're bringing in a new affix called Storming, which is basically, if you've ever played King's Rest, it's those little tornadoes in the first boss room, those little, like, circular things that spin around. They nerfed the damage that they dealt originally on the beta. So now they don't deal nearly as much damage, but they do knock you further.
So just to so for all the melee that are in chat right now, that I can fuck whoever decide. I don't know what drugs they were on when they made this effect, but people have a problem for that in King's Rest in general, and then the second boss of Shrine for that exact reason. You can't see them half the time, and I watched someone show it off. You still can't see them. Yes, they don't do as much damage, but being knocked around is already annoying as hell. And just, I don't know why they decided to do that. It gives so many reasons for Melee to hate their life even more, and it's already, like, you either update the model on them so that they are easier to see, or just don't do it. Like, literally just don't do it.
Well, it's not only a melee affix, by the way. Casters that want to sit in a hard cast, if they see that tornado coming at them, yeah, they can dodge it. They probably won't take the damage or get the knockback. But man, it's so fucking irritating, especially as, like, even a shaman right now. I have a lot of, like, movement tech in my kit to be able to cast and move. But if I'm ever at a point where it's like, I need to turret to do this damage, and I see that tornado, immediately I'm like, fuck, I'm missing 2 to 3 GCDs. Maybe there's another one coming right afterwards. It's going to affect everyone. It's just kind of it feels like a shitty affix, to be quite honest.
For lower tier, I agree. I think for lower tier players up to about plus 18, this is going to make life hard. It's not going to be impossible, but it's going to be so annoying. I think, like, this is going to be one of the most hated affixes for lower tier play. But for higher tier play, they never had a problem with NATOs, because in plus 27s and plus 28s, if you get hit by one of those NATOs in King's Rest, you're dead. If you get hit by one of those NATOs on a Shrine of the Storm boss, you're dead. Like, period. Regardless if it's fortified or tyrannical, you're dead, right? So higher tier melee players know how to dodge this stuff. But this affix doesn't buff the mobs at all. It doesn't do anything to the mobs. There's no on death affix. It doesn't pump them up. It doesn't scale anything. So yeah, you have to move a little bit more. Cool. But, like, it doesn't do anything to the mobs. So I think on a higher tier level, this is going to be like a pumped up version of Volcanic, but it's still going to be a push weak affix.
I'll agree with you mostly, but I have watched some top players get slammed by those King's Rest tornadoes and Shrine tornadoes quite often because they can't see them. Like, I don't think it'll be that big of a problem if they just updated the model. I think it has less to do with them not wanting to move or just the fact they can't see them. And, like, one of the big problems with Shrine was you literally couldn't see them because they blend in with the ground. If that becomes a problem in, like, other dungeons where it's like they blend in with the scenery, that's when it'll be an issue. I don't think the affix itself is an issue. It's the model that's an issue.
Okay, so that's a very good point. So the next new affix is called Inspiring. It's basically the Tide Emissary from Ashara. So if you guys don't remember what that is, what it is that there is a mob in a pack that has essentially a radius buff on it that prevents any of those ads to be CC'd at all, whether it be interrupts or hard CC or pushbacks or anything. Like, they cannot be modified. But that one ad can. The thing is that you think to yourself, if you interrupt that one ad, does it allow you to interrupt other ads? No. So if you stun that one ad, it doesn't allow you to interrupt or stun any other ads. It is a permanent buff, right? I think in lower tier, it's going to be annoying, but I think it can be handled with higher DPS. But in higher tier, it's going to put so much value on any melee class that can taunt and kite to pull that ad away from the pack while the rest of the group kills it.
And it can't be knocked back like the one in from the Beguiling seasonal?
Yeah, no, it can be. It can be because these well, it depends on the mob, right? Some mobs can be knocked back, some mobs cannot, right? So, like, it depends on which mobs are going to have that buff. I don't know which ones are. I haven't paid too much attention to the dungeons to know, but it's basically the Tide Emissary.
What would be really interesting to see, especially since Disc Priest is looking so strong for Mythic Plus, is if certain ones can be mind controlled and you just run it off somewhere else while the rest of the group kills the group. Because if it doesn't have as inspiring mob, you're not going to need to heal much in the first place. So that would be an interesting thing to see come out of this. But I think the affix will be fine. Just a little bit more play around it.
Yeah. I think there's going to be, play around room with it. Is there any other things you want to say there, Rise or Meeps?
I think you guys about hit it on the nose.
Yeah.
It's. I think it'll be fun. I think it'll be interesting enough to see how people handle it, but I don't think it's top tier or low tier. I think it's just it's middle of the pack.
So last affix, that's the newest one that's being added, and personally, my favorite for not the Prideful is the seasonal affix, but these are just regular weekly affixes. This affix I feel like is going to get so abused, and I feel like if it what do you call that? If it interacts with Alliance as well as I think it's going to, WoW Allowance is going to be so strong for that week, and that is Spiteful, right? So it's a new on death affix, right? When an ad dies, it's going to spawn a ghost of that ad, basically like your corruption, the way it works right now, that ad that chases you, it's going to spawn that. Now these ads do 100% more physical damage than normal ads do in the dungeon. So if they walk up to you and hit you, they hit you really, really hard. But they lose 8% of their max HP per second until they die.
Okay. Do they also cast?
They do not. They literally just choose a random player and run at them.
Oh, random player.
Yes.
This sounds
a random
awful.
player.
That's important information. Because if they don't have a threat table, that would make sense because then
There
the
is no
tank
threat
wouldn't
table.
just pull threat and get murdered. However, for everyone else, that's actually... It changes the dungeon dynamically, depending on how you do some pulls. Because if you pull really big, and with things like uncapped AoE, again, it'll be a talking point later. But if you're killing only 1 or 2 mobs at a time, and there's still 3 or 4 more mobs, and all of a sudden you're a melee DPS and you get targeted, but you're in melee, you need to just leave. You need to stop whatever you're doing and get away. And if you don't have a movement speed cooldown, if there's not CC, you're dead.
Or cloak
That's
or
actually
buff.
Slows or any of that.
Yeah.
I've seen this affix. People were saying that this affix is probably going to wipe the most keys out of almost any affix, just because they've already noticed it one-shots healers at mediocre keys. Not even high keys. It's mediocre keys are one-shotting healers, and there's some where people are like, yeah, if you kill an entire mob group, 4 could just go on your healer, and they have nowhere to go.
Yeah.
So here's my question, right? So we know that obviously slows and CCs are going to be vastly important with this affix, right? We know that Frost Mages are going to be super strong. I think Affliction Warlocks with that Legendary are going to be super strong. I think that Rogues with their AoE slows are going to be super strong. For that affix, that's great. But here's my question. How does this interact with Shadow Meld?
Well, if it works the exact same way that it thing from Beyond does now, it'll just walk off randomly and do nothing, or it goes to another player. That sometimes happens.
Yep.
Sometimes if you get rid of your thing from Beyond, you go invis or whatever, it just walks to a different player and kind of stands there and stares at them.
So what happens if all 5 members of the group have Shadow Meld and you do this huge pull with Prideful, you bust all of them, and all of a sudden there's these 30 Spiteful mobs that spawn out and start chasing everybody, and instead of trying to kite everything, you all just go Shadow Meld.
Well, everything resets. The entire pool resets, so you do some damage, but if you Shadow Meld before everything's dead, then you essentially just need to pull it all over again.
But they're losing 8% of their HP per second.
Yeah, so even if they break combat, they're just going to stand there and tick down. Might be the thought
exactly.
process.
I'm talking about what you're pulling. Say you're pulling regular mobs, a huge pull. You're still going to have to kill them. And if everyone Shadow Melts at the same time, they're all going to go back to their normal path.
Correct, but if you can have enough CC to where you kill all of the mobs, and all the mobs are dead, and now all that's alive is Spiteful mobs, and then all 5 players Shadow Meld.
All the Spiteful mobs theoretically just stand there,
die,
nothing,
right?
And then you're skipping a potentially dangerous mechanic. Whether or not that's worth it, we'll have to see, but that is potentially a large advantage.
Yeah.
To be honest, I can already see why Resto Druids are going to be even more strong now, because they have even more CC to deal with these things. It's honestly, most of these affixes, I'm realizing they just want Resto Druids to be the kings of healing.
Yeah. I mean, mass intake, they can be modified by CC, right?
Yeah.
So here's the idea. You can also do this. You can spawn all of them. You can have a Blood DK mass grip them all, and then you can just have the Resto Druid mass entangle them and walk away.
Or a Cyclone, and they just never get there.
Yeah, and they just die. And you just walk away. And you're just like, okay, Chuck Testa, see ya. Like, so there's multiple ways around this, but I feel like in order to get around it, you have to have a group that knows what they're doing. So I feel like for lower tier play, this is going to fuck a lot of people up. But for higher tier people, they're just going to be like, this is the coolest affix ever. It's a push weak affix because we can totally deal with it.
I think it'll be a fun affix for high tier, but I don't think it'll be that big of an issue.
Yeah, honestly. For sure. So the next affix that's changing is Sanguine. Sanguine is changing from 60 seconds to 20 seconds. So when you spawn a Sanguine pool, instead of lasting for 60 seconds, it lasts for 20 seconds now. This is just to cater to the casuals, man. Like, higher tier players already knew how to position the Sanguine, even in Toldagor. Like, I have a 2-star 23 Toldagor on a Sanguine week because the tanks knew where to put the Sanguine. So it really wasn't as bad as people said it was. It was just people didn't know what they were doing. So I've seen plenty of 29s, 28s, and 29s that were done with Sanguine. So Sanguine is not that bad of an affix. It's just super hard for lower tier because lower tier, one of the biggest problems they have is understanding the importance of positioning for the mobs. So, this is a cool cater to the casuals. That's all I got to say about it.
Well, I also wonder if it will be beneficial in some dungeons. Not to go into a ton of spoilers about every single dungeon. I know that there is one dungeon that has some old faces returning. No, it's the one that has all the undead bosses, and you're fighting that huge colossal titan at the end. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's
the other side.
Yeah, the other side. That dungeon has a couple spots where there are some pretty tight corridors. So, saying that like, oh, well, now we don't have to worry about backtracking as often, or depending on the environment that you're in, you have more opportunities. It probably will not make a difference for high tier play, but it actually will make a difference for medium to low tier play because you'll have that extra availability. It all depends on the environment of the dungeon that you're dealing with. Because if it's a big open room, who fucking cares? Make them last forever, and you're probably not even gonna have to deal with it. Some boss rooms, I don't think I've ever stepped in certain spots in some of those boss rooms, just because you've never had a reason to. But if there's a bunch of trash before a boss and it drops and it's permanent, like, still people can get around that. It's still useful, still doable.
I do want to say just real quick, whenever we do say like medium to low tier play, 95% of the community sees 15s as hard. So I think it's just going to be good for the entire community in general. Just because like we in the top 1% of Mythic Plus runners can do it doesn't mean that 95% of the other players even want Sanguine to be a thing.
That 95% of the player basis accounts for medium to low tier play. Anyway, I think 99% of the player basis actually counts for medium to low tier play, and 1% counts for high tier. Because I think for high tier, people would consider high tier to be anything like for current tier, anything above all 24s done, all 23s and 24s done would be considered high tier. And if you actually look at like Raider IO scores, that is legitimately like 0.2% of the population that has all 24s done. So, yeah. So moving on, we have volcanic changes. Okay, so volcanic is no longer going to scale with percent HP. It now scales with the dungeon levels with a flat amount of damage, and it has a knock-up that knocks you 30 yards into the air.
Wait. Oh, okay, so if you get hit by volcanic, I thought
it'll knock you up.
I thought for half a second we were talking about explosive, and my mind was just like, excuse me?
Please
but
no.
No, I think that's fine with volcanic. It punishes you more. It just is gonna ingrain in your head, you have to dodge it. Now it's not, can I soak this one volcanic to do an extra little bit of damage? It's okay, I actually have to move now, but now that's ingrained in your head. It's not the biggest change. Like, it'll help very marginally.
I will say it did need a change because almost every time during a volcanic dungeon, my highest damage taken was volcanic because it was so easy to heal through that the healers would just tell you to stand in it. Elfville would literally tell me, just stand and do damage. I will heal through with a Holy Shock. It was such a boring and easy a fix. It was insane.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, exactly. That's the problem. I think this is a high tier fix. I think for low tier, it doesn't really fix anything. I think it's going to do whatever. For high tier, this is going to be a fix because in high tier, even on plus 26s, you were just like, the healers should just be like, yo, just stand in that shit. Who cares? Like, nothing's going to happen to you. You're fine. Now because it's a flat damage scaling with it, it's going to hit you like a truck. And when you get hit by the 30-yard knockup, you actually do take fall damage when you fall back down, by the way. So it's a twofer.
You know,
But
that's all well and good, but the thing that's going to prevent casters from standing in Volcanic is the fact that their damage is going to be stopped for a few seconds.
yes,
Yeah, the knockup.
yes, yes. Here's the concern I have about this. Not even concern. I think it's gonna be fun, right? Because I know that someone's gonna do this and it's gonna get nerfed immediately. But I just want to see it. I want to see someone that does it. Remember, this thing knocks you up 30 feet into the air, right? What if you have like a healer class or a demon hunter, right? That gets knocked 30 feet in the air, and it's a dungeon that has some type of verticality to it, and they can just skip shit with it.
Oh,
They can rocket jump to somewhere else,
So
or they
that's-
can glide into another part because of the fact that Volcanic knocked them up in the air, and then they just tell the team, "Hey, go wipe." So they jump off the edge, and then they just do a mass reg, and now everyone's spawned back up, like, you know. Like, think of Cathedral of Eternal Night in Legion, right? Like, just being popped up in the air and just like skipping a whole staircase worth of bullshit, or Black Rickhold or Upper Karazhan or any of that, right? I feel like that can get abused somewhere if there are dungeons that have verticality. And from what I've heard from Dratnos and from Dratnos now and from J. They are all saying that, yes, there are dungeons that have verticality to them, and they are concerned about that volcanic affix being abused, because a holy paladin will just bop the person that's going to get hit by the volcanic. The volcanic will still hit them up in the air, and they can fly off into that one spot, and they're good to go.
That's something that I've personally abused back in Legion before they changed the toy that would launch you high into the air and then send you flying forward. They fixed it later on, but in the first...
Emerald Winds, right?
Yeah. No, it was before that.
Emerald Winds was the toy you might be thinking of, though.
Yeah.
The one that you would get from High Mountain.
Or no, wow, I'm not even thinking Legion. I'm thinking of pre-Legion. Or what was Skyreach? Skyreach was pre-Legion. Okay. So
That was,
I wasn't
that
born
was
yet,
WoD.
so...
yeah.
That was WoD.
That was Warlords, and that's why it's kind of been fixed since then. But in the very beginning of Warlords, you could get a toy early on that would launch you high into the air and then shoot you forward. I went to the last, from the very entrance of a dungeon to the last boss immediately. So I think so. It's something that they've encountered before. So I doubt we'll really see much abuse of it because they've already experienced it before and they've fixed. Like, they've been on the lookout for that sort of thing since then.
Yeah, I mean, like, if they're pretty much literally deleting all snap holes. I mean, Now has been doing this for 3 weeks. He still has not found a single snap hole
Fuck.
in all of the dungeons. So I'm pretty sure that Blizzard is on top of this and it won't be abused. But I mean, it's just one of my concerns. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
But imagine though the world in which you're looking at like the Mythic Plus leaderboards for a certain dungeon, and you're like, oh, they're running a really fucking weird comp, and they have like a 32 done on this dungeon. They used a Holy Paladin, a Demon Hunter. Oh wait, I can see that. Like, that could be a really interesting thing, but it could be toxic if people think that that's needed. Again, going back to a slight topic of community perception, but
So it's
we'll see.
So I speed it up a little bit here. I think we don't have too much time left. I want to get through most of the topics. So bursting, right? Bursting, it no longer scales with percent HP and now scales with key level, and it can be dispelled. So,
Thank God. I'm going into this game as a disc priest. I have MD. I don't care about bursting at all.
Bursting,
that does give a lot of viability to certain.
So the thing about bursting was that it was one of the worst lower tier Mythic Plus affixes in the game, but it was super awesome. It was an absolute push affix for higher tier players. The reason being is that in lower tier, ads die faster and more chaotically. People can't control their DPS. So when you kill things faster and without control, bursting stacks so fast and healers have lower healing per second, and now people just die. But in higher tier, ads die slower. People know how to control their DPS, and healers have better healing per second numbers. So it's much more manageable. So the fact that this now no longer scales with HP, it scales with straight key level, means that in higher tier, 2 stacks of bursting could really mess you up. So you have to really control it better. And the fact that it can be dispelled, I think, is going to bring a lot more value to Priest. And it's going to bring a lot more value to other classes that couldn't really handle it too well. That's my opinions on it.
I mean, most Resto Shamans loved Bursting Week because Chain Heal was so stupid along with their mastery that you could walk into a dungeon with Bursting and it didn't matter. Even if you were messing up, you had Spirit Link and it wouldn't go through it that quickly. So it was a good one.
So the last affix is going to be Grievous. It now deals flat damage as well instead of percent HP. And non-periodic heals remove a stack of Grievous. This is so cool. I'm so happy about this. Like, this is going to enable so many more healers to deal with this affix, because originally I think Druids and Paladins were really the only ones that could like deal with this affix without going fucking But it's less punishing for having more stamina. Think about that for a second. For Grievous, right? Think about a Discipline Priest. Power Word Fortitude actually made you take more damage with Grievous, because Grievous did a percentage of your HP. So the more HP you had, the more damage you took. So by having a priest in your group, you actually hamstringed yourself even harder with that affix. And now it doing a flat amount of damage is going to allow those healers to kind of come in and heal through that, as well as the non-periodic heals. Removing a stack is going to be good. I don't know how Riptide does that. I don't know if Riptide is a dot or not.
It's an initial and then it's a dot afterwards, yeah.
Okay.
Or
so
a hot.
you could use Riptide to remove a stack, but only once. The other applications of Riptide will not.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how that interacts with Grievous.
Well, that also innately buffs the classes that were good, like Druid, because you can just have a Druid just cast a Wild Growth or cast a Rejuve like an extra. So it kind of works in everyone's favor, although I do think that it was necessary, because there were some classes that just had a hell of a time dealing with Grievous.
Yeah,
I remember trying to heal early on in a tier with a Resto Shaman, as a Resto Shaman, being like, man, I have to do Grievous? Fuck, if someone gets 2 stacks, I literally don't have enough throughput to heal them through it unless I burn a CD. Let alone be on a boss and there's some big mechanic and everyone gets hit for 20% of their HP. I have to use a cooldown, or I have to spam chain heals and hope I get crits, or hope that I have enough throughput on multiple targets to get through it. Now if it's a Druid can throw up some hots and a Rejuve, and it can diminish those stacks, even if they're low health, that's really good. A Shaman can throw out healing surges instead of chain heals, or a Riptide, or an Unleash Life, and help with those stack management. That's going to be big. Now, the big question that I wonder is that from any source? Can I be an Elemental Shaman and cast a healing surge on someone that has 5 stacks and it drops a stack?
Yes.
That's pretty good. That's
yes,
pretty
they already
good.
proved. Yes, they can. Any class that has a heal can that. And one of those classes they actually tested that with is Death Strike on a Death Knight. It does actually remove a stack of Grievous.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Then that's not really going to be that bad for certain specs, because certain specs have such crazy periodic minor heals in themselves, they can just get rid of it almost.
So rogues, one of the ones they have, one of the defensives they have is that they heal 30% of their HP over 6 seconds. The initial tick of the 30% HP will remove a stack of Grievous, but the rest will not.
So I have a very unusual question. How is that going to work with Leech? Because I'm thinking of a Demon Hunter. It's just, hey, I cast a Chaos Strike, I healed, I get a stack of Grievous gone. Is that how it might work? Because that might be kind of broken.
No, because it's not a spell, right? It's a derived form. Like the Leech is not considered a spell. It's considered a derivative of another spell. It's not coded the same way, and so because of that, it has to be an actual spell that's non-periodic that is actually healing.
Got it.
Okay, whenever you say...
Go ahead.
Oh, so whenever you say non-periodic, that means atonement, each tick of atonement won't? Because if that's the case...
Yes, they were talking about that. Yes, Dratnos was talking about that for a priest. You could use atonement and combo it with another spell. I can't remember what it was, but he did bring it up. It was atonement and another spell, and you legitimately, every single time atonement ticked, it would remove a stack of Grievous.
Okay, then Disc Priest will literally be not even caring, because atonement plus penance would insta-heal that entire thing. So... Also, Shadow Priest will never have to put up with it, because Vampiric Embrace with their dots will last long enough that it'll just heal themselves, if that's how it's thinking.
I also
Grievous,
wonder how
I think
that
it's going to be a
interacts.
new push week affix, honestly, with the way that is now synergizing, that non-periodic heals removes a stack. It will not go from 1 to 0. So let's correct that once for real quick. It will not take 1 stack to 0, but it will take the stacks all the way to 1. But with the way that it's scaling, we don't know how it's going to hit. What if it scales so hard that at a plus 28 or plus 27 level, 1 stack of Grievous is knocking you down for 33% of your HP?
Yeah, that might be hard. As a side note, I wonder how that's going to work with Beacon. because you can just take the talent for multi-beacon as a holy paladin. You can beacon multiple people, and every time you heal, everyone gets a stack removed. That could be pretty
Correct.
cool.
Yes, that's exactly how it works. Yes.
That's good.
It also works. It also works the chain heal on Resto.
Yeah, Grievous is not looking like an affix that's actually going to matter.
That's going to be a push week affix.
Yeah, it's looking real. That change is making Grievous be a real nice affix. So that is it for the affix changes. We're done with that. So I want to talk about what Rise was talking about. That kind of blew into that, right? Which is how utility converts into damage, right? The TLDR of this aspect for people who are new is that if you take less damage, you can do bigger pulls. If you can do bigger pulls, that means that you arbitrarily give yourself the largest DPS increase in the game for Mythic Plus. Because if I'm able to do 2 packs in the same time that you can do 1 pack, because that's just how AoE works, then I have arbitrarily given myself 100% damage increase. So the best offense is the best defense. And all forms of utility, though there are different ways of doing it, the hows are different. The end game is that you take less damage.
So what do you mean, man? You don't need utility. Just do more damage, forehead.
I kind of want to come at this from a healer standpoint that I think Rise can kind of come in on, since I'm going to talk about Resto Shaman a lot with this, since that's what I played in Mythic Plus. Resto Shamans, so like keeping your tank alive, for instance, is something Resto Shamans have yet to figure out how to do correctly. We don't have a tank external, and Earth Shield, most people don't even buy into their bars unless they're doing PvP. So they have such a huge issue keeping alive their tank. Like, you can keep everyone else alive. Chain Heal's stupid OP, you have Spirit Link and all this other stuff. But keeping your tank alive is hard. It's a lot of Riptides and Chain Heals to get Tidal Wave procs and then just Healing Surge the shit out of them. And that's a major issue that we talked about a little bit before, where if you don't have the utility, you don't have the defensives, you don't have the ability to keep your tank up, your tank's going to be afraid, and like you said, it's not going to be able to pull enough packs for even certain specs who need big pulls to be able to do big damage. You know, like a Fire Mage pulling on 1 pack at a time right now is so much worse than if you were to pull like 19 packs, you know? A little overboard, but I'm just saying. And like for a Shaman, Shamans can barely put up with like that many like a couple packs more, because it's, I could just play a Holy Pally, I have Lay on Hands, I have Beacon, I have all kinds of shit to keep my tank alive. Resto Shaman's freaking out, pressing the same button over and over again and hoping he doesn't take more damage than he already is. So that's kind of my issue.
Yeah, so not only does a Resto Druid allow you to bring like DOS to the whole rest of the team and have stronger single target healing, but let's also think about the other things that Resto Druids have. They have a battle res, and they have how many ways to control the mobs? They got entanglement, mess entanglement, typhoon. Like, I mean, you name it, they have how many ways to control mobs. So like, not only are they better at single target healing, not only can they just keep the group alive, not only can they just literally control all the fucking mobs, but they also have battle reses. So like the amount of utility that, they can also do damage. Just want to add that in there, that little sprinkle of like fuck you. But they're just the best for this instance, and that's the reason why some classes are better than others, right? It's not necessarily their damage. Like the rogue, if you look at it, mages, right? They're known for like not having really any interrupts. They can still output 5 interrupts in a minute, between the combination of Dragon's Flame and Counterspell, right? Rogues, with all their interrupts, they're not the 2-minute cooldown ones, can do 7 interrupts in a minute. That extra 2 interrupts is the break point to be able to pull an extra pack. Rogues are never brought for their damage. Rogues are brought for their ability to keep themselves alive, and they were brought for their ability to control the adds. And if you can do that and do 2 packs at the same time, you're doing way more damage.
I do want to be honest, if a Resto Shaman did not have their kick, the only healer is a kick, I don't think people would remember Resto Shamans are a healer in the first place in Mythic Plus. Yeah. So I definitely know where you're coming from, where something utility-wise is going to be important and remembered.
And this is just why, guys, like utility is so valued in Mythic Plus. It just is, because like the ability to pull packs the way that they can, they're the only class that can do it. Right, it's a combination of multiple things. It's not just their interrupts. It's their interrupts. It's their mobility. It's their way to self heal. It's their way to move across the maps. It's their way to help with other things. It's their single target. It's their AOE. It's the combination of everything. I like to refer to Mythic Plus as the CrossFit of WoW. Right, it's like the combination of everything, and that's kind of how it is. But there is a way to control this to bring other classes into retrospect, which is kind of this next subject, which is how they're capping AoE. So does anybody have any opinions on the uncapped versus capped AoE, what they know about it, and how it's going to play out in Shadowlands?
My only opinion is I wish there was a more comprehensive list, because, and also they keep changing, or still up until like the past couple of weeks, they've been changing what's capped and what's not capped. And now it's not just capped or uncapped. There's capped, soft cap, uncapped. Like,
there's another one too. Square root secondary targeting.
Oh, right.
Yeah, which, God, I don't even want to think about that right now. But yeah, it's weird to note as well on that topic that there are some classes where it's very streamlined, it's very obvious, but they're not necessarily fair. To say, like, for a warlock, for example, you know, one of their dots can affect multiple targets up to an uncapped point, versus, you know, this class, I get to click one ability every X amount of time, and that one ability might not be as equal as another class. You know, for example, like a Shadow Priest to an Elemental Shaman. A Shadow Priest can throw out a bunch of dots, and they will last forever and be uncapped in this situation. But every, 8 or 9 GCDs, depending on how much Maelstrom I'm getting, I can cast one Earthquake. And the damage of my one Earthquake does not usually meet or equal the amount of damage that a Shadow Priest could be doing with an uncapped amount of dots. So it's really hard to balance, because if you skew the Earthquake damage, then all of a sudden they become broken in certain scenarios, versus, the Shadow Priest, if they cap the dots, then the class would be pointless. Sorry, Shadow Priest. Sorry, Cappy. But, you just have, it's such a weird way to balance this, and there's not really a good way to balance all these numbers. It's a numerical nightmare when you're looking at, okay, how many mobs are we pulling? We're pulling 8. There's probably an answer which class actually does the most uncapped damage at 8 targets versus 16 targets versus 30 targets, and all the answers are going to be vastly different. And also, it's going to dynamically change how people play, which I'm all for in that aspect, but as long as they can figure out a way to make it fair for each class, because you can't have a class that's just like, you literally cannot compete ever at all. It's numerically impossible. That's when you get large outliers, and that's where I think a problem becomes. And that's partly because of the kit, but also because of the tuning.
I feel it's a very botched way to try to balance the game numerically without trying to force specific classes to lose their class identity.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good way to present it. Yeah,
it becomes this argument where, like, here's what's going to happen, right? We're looking at specific classes saying what's capped, what's uncapped, right? And what's the meta going to be, right? Well, let's look at Demon Hunters for a second, right? Did they lose any of their utility? Nope. So let's look at their uncapped AoE. They have one ability that's uncapped. Sorry, one ability that's capped. My bad. They have one ability that's capped. That's it. Let's look at Frost Mage. They still keep their utility? Yeah. Let's look at their capped AoE. Oh, they have one ability that's capped. Let's look at Rogues. All of their abilities are capped except for Poison Bomb for the Assassination Rogue. But nobody brought a Rogue for their damage in the first place. Like, everyone brought a Rogue for their utility. So your top 2 DPS specs that you're like trying to shift the meta in and like trying to shake up things and let there be more variety in the game, the top 2 DPS are still there and they still bring the same amount of utility, right? I feel like this is going to create an even, like, I hope it doesn't, because objectively in lower tiers for plus 15s, it's going to allow players to have a variety of classes to be able to be played, because nobody's going to be able to play that spec to the level that the higher tier players are playing it. And therefore that uncapped versus capped AoE differential isn't going to mean a fucking thing, because no one's pulling 3-4 packs in a plus 15, right? But the thing that scares me is that players have this knack, they have a tendency to look at higher tier players and look at like, oh, this is the best comp for plus 25s. Well, this is what I have to do for plus 15s in order to have the least resistance and the least amount of friction to get my weekly chest. But they forget that those players that are playing those classes at plus 15 levels are not abusing the power and the utility of those classes that other players are doing at plus 25s. And therefore, any other class would have sufficed just fucking fine.
True, and that's just an issue that is going to continue going forward. I don't think that there's any way.
You can't fix that. You cannot fix that. That is a human nature issue. And there's no game design perspective that you could do to change that. That is a human psychology problem, and that is apparent in not just games, but in every subject across the planet, right? People think that it's a gear or money or a car or whatever. They think it's some object that is allowing this person to be as successful or amazing as they are, without forgetting that it's the person using that object that empowers their ability to do something. So that's just human psychology 101, and I don't think there's a way to fix that. But I can give Blizzard some credit in at least trying to do something to bring variety to the game without losing class identity. Even though it's botched as fucked, at least they're trying something.
I think that actually goes into how soon Shadowlands is releasing. I hope that the next expansion takes a very long time to come out. I don't care if we do have another 8.3 situation where everyone's ground to dust on the game currently. They need, like, I don't know if need is the right word, but they keep applying minor fixes or like little change ups to hopefully tweak things to where it's acceptable, when what they need to do is go back to the drawing board and see how can we actually fix the underlying issues instead of trying these slapdash patches.
I mean, like, Blizzard likes to talk about how they want you to have choice, and don't get me wrong, you do have a choice, and WoW, you have the choice of either having class fantasy and sucking so bad at what you want to do that you're not going to play anyways, or you be really, really good at it, and you're the most stale thing you can possibly have. Playing a Shadow Priest, the fact that I can't use Surrender to Madness makes me more mad than I think people understand. Like, there's no such thing as class fantasy unless you choose to be bad. And I feel like that's the best way to make fun of Blizzard for the fact that they say that.
I don't think it's choose to be bad. I think it's choose to not be optimal.
Fair.
Yeah, I mean, it's really rough to look at Frost Mages and see that they are the best Mythic Plus range class right now, and they have 3 buttons. They have 3 spells. Like, that's all they cast is 3. But they can transition between AoE, cleave, and single target better than any other class in the game. They have the lowest skill ceiling out of any other ranged DPS spec, like easier than Beastmaster Hunter, which I didn't even know was fucking possible, but apparently it is. They can do that, and they're the best spec in the game for Mythic Plus. That blows my mind.
But
I don't know, we're more patches from Rapid Shot being the only button Marksman Hunters press.
Okay, yeah, that's way back in the day. But
Yeah.
It keeps getting buffed. Like, it keeps just last night. But I definitely have to. The uncapped capped AoE thing, I understand why they did it, but in a bigger idea, I feel like it wasn't as necessary as they think it was.
Yeah, I don't think it was necessary at all.
On that note, Otter, though, it seems like the more simple classes are the better ones. I mean, Havoc Demon Hunter, Beastmaster Hunter.
Yeah, and I want to play Affliction Warlock. How do you think I feel?
Right.
So we got 2 more topics before we want to close this, and we got 20 minutes, so let's try to get this through. All right, so I think this is one that Cappy really wanted to talk about, right? Rewards for hierarchies completed that show off beyond a number. I think Meeps likes this one too, right? This IO thing, like the only thing that separates me from being awesome at the end game content that I'm doing is a number that more than half the people don't have the add-on downloaded to just look at. So how do you guys feel about that, and what do you think they can do to improve that?
So I definitely later on we'll talk about the reason why I think that the whole gearing thing changed, which actually makes this worse. I now go past a FIP 14 and I'm getting nothing for it gear wise. I do the same thing I do now. I take that piece of gear and I sell it. I have no reason for it, and there's no reason for it at all. I'm doing a 23 and I get nothing for it. I get my mount at 15. I am 8 key levels higher and I get not a single thing for it besides a number that, again, you said some people don't even have. And it's a very toxic number. I love pushing IO. I like seeing that number go up. But in general, it is objectively just a very toxic thing that the game has because it creates elitism. And people can walk around and go, I have a 4K IO, you have a 1K IO, you are bad at the game. They could be 12 out of 12 Mythic first week. Mm-hmm.
It creates lies because you never, dude. I have run into this so many freaking times where I pull someone in that's like 3,800 IO, and I'm like, we're gonna get through this so easy, only to find out that they paid like $400 to have their goddamn IO. So it's just lies. You just don't know who's actually good and who's actually bad until you start hitting like the 5K, 6K IO marks, because you can't buy your way to that high of an IO level.
And exactly, and that's where I feel like, as nice as IO is, the one thing I'd love to see is a reward. If I do 23s, if I hit what would be considered right now like a 4K IO, I want a hot mount that I can walk around on, that I'm just like, hey guys, I see all of you don't happen to have this mount. It's probably because I'm pretty great. It's the same thing with like PvPers right now. They have that Drake, the Proto Drake with the Glad helmet on. That thing looks awesome. But if I'm doing PvE, what do I get? A chance at the end of the last boss of Mythic that I might be able to get the nice mount, which right now is the All-Seer. What about Mythic Plus? I did a 23. Like, come on, give me something.
Well, there is, if you do a 15 of every dungeon, you get a different colored worm.
But even then,
oh my God, Rise, that's perfectly true.
Yeah. So one of the solutions I would think, like I'd say one of the problems, are also one of the solutions, right? The thing that frustrates me is that every end of game activity, whether it be Mythic Plus, PvP, or Raid, gives you that 226 piece of loot at the end of the week. But from Mythic Raiding, you can get multiple 226 pieces from just doing the activity. And from PvP, you can get a 226 piece by building up conquest and then using that at a vendor to give you a 226 piece, right? And you also get your vaults. So for PvP, you have a way to get a 226 and the vault. And from Raid, you have a way to get 226 and the vault. For Mythic Plus, you have a way to get a 210, I think. Let me double check this real quick. 210. Yeah, 210 at Mythic 15, and that's it. You cannot get a 226 from Mythic Plus except for your vaults. What if they inserted a way of currency, right, where it's kind of like echoes? The higher key you do, the more of that currency you get, and with that currency, you can go to a vendor, and once a week you can pay for a random piece of a specific slot of gear, or like Titan Residium, you can pay an even greater amount of resource for that specific one that you want for that week. You can use that as a resource. So the higher keys you go, the more of those echoes you get. Those echoes you use to buy that gear, but you can only do it once a week instead, so that you can't farm it, because Mythic Plus is notorious for being able to farm stuff.
Which it's pretty clear that they have that system pretty much implemented for PvP, and it seems to work pretty well. It's worked well in the past. I don't like Titan Residium and that whole debacle with, Azerite and how that vendor works, but regardless, it is rewarding to go to a Mythic cache and see that I have 2,000 Residium and know that my 15, or, if I get 4,000 Titan Residium, my 22 that I did that week gave me some sort of value contextually to my character, not just on top of, oh, I did a key, I got a random piece of loot, my box is a little bit better, but I put in the work and I went above and beyond, and I get something a little bit nicer for my character, whether or not it's this week or it's next week, but it assists me. There's a purpose to doing it for some people. That should be a driving force. They should have something implemented. And it doesn't need to be, broken. It doesn't need to make a certain character really overpowered, but giving the ability for characters and people that push really high content and stretch the limits, the extra reward should feel good, and that should be incentive for people to also go out and do it themselves or try it themselves. Even if it's just
a number.
Yeah, even if it's a very small amount. Even if it was like for the legendaries going into Shadowlands. Like, if you did, a key and it gave you a little bit of Soul Ash, and if you did one higher, it gave you like an extra 5 Soul Ash, that'd be sick.
Yeah. Yeah, that'd be great, but unfortunately, and even with the current BFA system, they're doing that with Echoes and with Titan Residium and stuff like that. But with Shadowlands, there's none of that. It's just like, cool, you get a higher number and you get your Mythic Plus cachet because you did this many dungeons. You get 3 chances at a better piece of loot. And it's just like, yeah, but every activity has that. Plus, they also have another drop that I can get.
I think we'll see something like the Titan Residuum crop up in 9.1.
I'm hoping so.
At the very least 9.2. So, and that's something that was really smart to point out, is right now a lot of classes can't get their best Azerite gear without doing Mythic Plus. So right there, you're required to do Mythic Plus. There's your extra reward from doing Mythic Plus. But at the same time, like you guys were saying, you don't need to push really high keys to get this reward. Yeah. The highest reward available is doing all Mythic 15s, and you get the achievement and mount.
I have a weird reason as to why I think they're doing it, though. And I brought this up in our conversation last night, which kind of goes into the reason why the gear shuts off so quickly and it's not that good going into heroic gear.
Segue.
Real quick, yeah. So honestly, Blizzard really seems to be focusing on their story in this expansion more than I think they have in a while. Especially with the 4 covenants, and they're talking about choice and which each one feels and stuff like that. The way that the dungeons are working are very focused onto moving into the story. Each of your stories kind of moves up, and I think the way that they're going about this is making you progress your gear through story rather than the actual true difficulty. Your gear stops becoming good at 14, in a sense. Then you move into heroic. Then you move into mythic. And the way that the story seems to be going is that, I go into Venthyr Dungeon, I beat this, not really all that, big, in theory, story mob, and then I get this story to go into the castle and go kill Sire and go kill the Stoneborn generals. And that, to a lot of players that I've met, is really cool. And I think that they're trying to stay with that, where that you want your gear, you go and kill the story's big guys. Not, some mob from a Venthyr dungeon. You can get some decent gear, but you want to take that gear and you want to go kill Sire. You want to go kill whoever the next raid boss, in tier is going to be. And I think they care more about their story, and they want people to progress more through that rather than just oh, wow, I did a 20. Look at me, I'm already mythic geared and I can walk in. I don't think it has anything to do with stopping the world first at all, because Limit Maximum already talked about it. He was like, we're going to figure it out. There's a reason why we're world first. We know how to get our gear no matter what you do. So 100%. I think it's a strong thing.
I will agree 100%. They're facading this, saying that oh, this is going to slow down the mythic first race. By what margins? I don't understand what you mean, because there's a reason why they're world first, mate. And it's because they have the amount of resources they do, and they are going to find a way to feed themselves that gear. You came out with corruption saying that corruptions can only, and then BOEs came and they just spent how much gold to get what they did. There's going to be a way around it, and there's a reason why the world's first, and they're going to find a way around it. I will say this, though it is story driven, I'm still a bit happy about it. Even though it's story driven. And the reason being is that in current tier BFA, if I do Mythic Plus and I fully gear myself, I get 465 gear. There's no reason for me to have anything from Heroic Raid, except for maybe one piece being a trinket or something. And even worse than that, a 465 piece of gear with perfect stat weights is going to outweigh a 475 without optimal stat weights. But if that piece of gear was 450 or 460, would the optimal stat weights outweigh the power of a 475 unoptimized stat weight piece of gear? The answer is no. The 475 would be more powerful. And what that means to me is that no longer am I going into raid from doing Mythic Plus into a Mythic raid, not a heroic, a Mythic raid doing Mythic Plus and going, oh, I'm not going to get any gear for the next 3 or 4 kills. I'm just going to sit here for 5 or 6 weeks of progression on my ass and twiddle my thumbs because I'm not getting anything out of it. Now, because that Mythic Plus loot is lower and Heroic and Mythic means something, it means that every boss has a piece of gear that I can look forward to.
I think that also I think that people do forget with the whole Heroic thing, because I've brought this up before with the whole story, and they'll be like, wouldn't it stop at normal though? I think people forget Heroic is the most played difficulty for Raid, if I'm not mistaken, because normal go into it for a challenge, Heroic progression, and then Mythic start there for gearing. All 3 difficulties go there. The only people that I know that don't are the people who do LFR. But that's
delete that from the game. Oh my god, it was the most atrocious system ever put into this game. We'll leave that for another time, but yeah.
But the rest of it is definitely, I think that they're trying to move that story for you to go Heroic or you go Mythic, and you're like, okay, let's go from this dungeon where it's not really all that matter to going and killing, whatever. Because right now what it feels like is you go into Underrot, and Kragmaw is harder than Gahoo. and that feels weird story-wise to Blizzard, and I feel like it's partially why they're trying to do what they're doing.
Well, and like bringing up Cahoon really isn't that great of a point because Cahoon was earlier on, so to keep the dungeons relevant, they've had to scale the dungeons up in Mythic Plus because we've scaled up, yet the rate has stayed the same. So like Cahoon is still the same worm that he was at the beginning of the expansion, whereas all the dungeon bosses have been scaled up to match us.
Well, I meant like when BOD was like, or not BOD, but Uldir was like still the main raid. Like Kragmaw still had a lot of health compared to Cahoon,
Right?
even though it was just on a tiny little mouth for a body. Like it just felt really weird, and I think that's why they kind of want to mess around with that. So.
Well, I think we can close this off here. So I'm actually looking forward. I know it sounds weird. I know we've pointed out a lot of problems and stuff like that, but like there's gonna be those with every aspect of the game. Whether it be PvP, Mythic Plus, Raid, there's always gonna be things that are broken or strongest in any game, in any situation. That's just an RPG element. That's just the way it's gonna go. But in terms of Mythic Plus, I think all of us here, except for Meeps, because he's a Debbie Downer, actually enjoy Mythic Plus to a point. Like, it's actually really fun, and it's a great system for replayability in the game. So, what do you guys say is your favorite or least favorite aspect of Mythic Plus?
Before we get into that, I just want to bring up one of the things I hate about Mythic Plus is they killed my challenge modes to bring Mythic Plus. They did not need to do that. But I guess since I said that, I'll go ahead and answer first, and that's my least favorite aspect. They killed my baby. Blizzard killed my baby.
That feels bad, man. Every time it's brought up. Here, let me link all the 30 some odd challenge mode, server first, world firsts that I have. Get out of here, you elitist. So I have there's something that I don't like about it, and then I have a potential fix. I hate that despite all of the information about, how it can go for some people, that Mythic Plus, even though it is incredibly fun, and it brings so much replayability to the scene and the game as a whole, people need to stop looking at things at face value and accept that, community perception is a really big part of the success and the downfall of some people in Mythic Plus. One thing that I think that they could do to fix it, that we didn't mention before, but again, just a little quick hot take, if they had an in-game leaderboard system, and at the end, Meeps can get his, I actually have, an achievement now in-game that says I am the world's best at X dungeon, because I completed X key. That could bring a huge flock of people to it.
Dude,
it'd be hard to do.
He's just looking at candy right now, man. He's like a 3-year-old looking at the van with candy and ice cream, dude. He's like,
man.
Yeah, dude.
I think if and again, quick hot take, if Blizzard cares, they should make an in-game leaderboard system. They did, obviously different, sub-company and different groups, but they have leaderboard systems for grifting and Diablo. They have, leaderboards for a lot of other games. They have them for, who's that good at Overwatch or at League of Legends. They have, those individual character leaderboards. If they made an in-game leaderboard, I think Mythic Plus would just get that much better, because it could change community perception. It could show, if I looked at shamans and I saw that the highest was a 27, now I can say, oh yeah, well, I can beat that. I can go in there and I can be the world rank 1 shaman, and I can see it in game. That could be something that could really be helpful to the community perception, which again, I think is personally the biggest.
I think people are going to derive two things from that leaderboard. Either A, they're going to look at it and be like, okay, they look at a Beastmaster Hunter, right? And they see that he has 3.5k IO. Oh, he's like number 10,000 in the world for IO, right? And then they're going to look at a Shadow Priest that has 3.5k IO, and they're going to be like, oh, he's number 20 in the world. So there's going to be two things that are going to drive that from that. Either A, this guy is really good at Shadow Priest, or B, wow, dude, Shadow Priest sucks some fucking dick, and we do not want to bring that into the...
So honestly, it's number 2 because I'm at 3.2 KIO, and I think I'm number 2 on Hyjal, and I'm like, man, people just do not play my spec, dude.
I'm number 2 Frost DK on Hyjal, and I have 3.5 KIO, so I'm right there with you, man.
I think it'll be less about the individual classes and players and more about the groups that do these keys. Like, whenever, as Rise put up, whenever we were putting up challenge mode world fastest times, it was the entire group. It wasn't just, well, this is the number 1 hunter, this is the number 1 Brewmaster, it was this group put up this time, and they were 50% faster than the group behind them. Holy shit. It's about the group, it's not about the individual.
Yeah,
Very cool.
I mean, they could have both. Just saying.
Yeah.
Again, we can go past this very quickly because we could rant about it for an hour. But you know, that's what I think is wrong with Mythic Plus. Community perception
No
affects
leaderboard.
players, and Blizzard should try to fix it somehow.
I mean, there's not really a leaderboard for anything. I don't think there's a leaderboard for raid either. You can't like check someone and be like, what's their raid? You know, what's their
not in
leaderboard
game.
for like their realm ranking in terms of their guild for raid. You have to like go to a separate site and look that up. So
Well-
I think that's a big hole in World of Warcraft, that is not an in-game way to look at someone's position. Like you brag about how competitive and how much better people want to be at this game and their drive, and then you show no way other than their effort to go look at some other source to find out where they are according to other people.
To be fair, PvP technically does have an in-game like leaderboard. To be fair, so I mean, in that sense, yeah, they already have the utility and the tools to do it. They just need to shift it over to a whole different game type. But to answer the whole question, I definitely think my favorite thing about Mythic Plus is the ability to adapt to situations. I play healer partially just due to the fact that in a raid you have to adapt to situations. You don't have this consistent, I have to press this in this order. It's adapting to what's going on. And when an entire game mode is based around, did you mess this up? How do you adapt to it? How do you do this to make this more useful? Or all this other stuff. It's not about just raw numbers to get through a Mythic Plus. It's about how are you going to go about it, and I love that a lot more than what dungeons could be, which is just how fast can you burn this down. Okay, move on to the next thing. So it's why I like raiding, because you can adapt, but it's also the reason why I love the small group version where you also have to adapt through Mythic Plus. I think my least favorite thing is kind of along the same terms of the community. IO is toxic as hell, and I think something needs to change about it. By like a long shot.
Yeah, I'll finish it up with saying my favorite thing about Mythic Plus is, as I said earlier, it's the CrossFit of World of Warcraft. Like, it is, you have to be good at everything. You have to be good at AoE, you have to be good at single target, you have to be good at cleave, you have to dodge cleave. I still haven't figured it out. You have to be able to do interrupts, you have to be mobile, you have to have mechanics down, you have to work with a team, you have to adapt. Like, it brings the best of everything into one activity. And I love that, because it means you can be reliable in any situation. That's why I think if someone's really freaking good at Mythic Plus, you can be good at raid and you can be good at PvP, because it just encapsulates everything. My least favorite subject is the same reasons you guys have. Fuck the community, man. God, they are so toxic, and they are so. It's like it's like World of Warcraft's form of racism. It is just so terrible.
It's just, I think the easy way for me to look at it is just that there's so many people in the community that seem to be misguided. They look at
Yeah,
they
they're
look at
just
some
misinformed.
information, they say, "Wow, Prot Warrior is the best. I guess I have to be a Prot Warrior, or I have to take a Prot Warrior." But it really doesn't matter. You can do any class. You can push any class to a high level. You just have to be willing to accept it. And obviously, sometimes you just can't trust people. Sometimes that burns a key. Sometimes you meet a really good player, but people are really misguided in their judgment or their thought process when they're applying for a 12 and they get denied even though they're a 3.2k IO resto shaman.
Yeah, ignorance fuels this toxicity, man. So let's talk about the riots.
God.
All right.
Podcast.
Before
This is a Simply WoW podcast.
Before we get to wrap up, Otter and Cappy, both of you are streamers. Otter, you want to plug your stream? No? Okay.
Otter? Is he gone? Oh, he's muted. We'll go to Cappy first.
Yeah, so you can come. He linked his. I'll link mine in a bit, but yeah, you can come see me at twitch.tv/Cappy with 8 Ys because 1 through 7 was taken. I stream me playing Priest and Shaman, now healing. So if you want to come check that out, I play other games. More specifically, Payday 2 recently. So if you like other games, come hang out and watch that too. But if you ever need help, tips, I have a stream that I love to help people out. So if you have any healer questions, come and hang out, and I'd love to answer them. But yeah, I'll go ahead and post a link.
So that's CAP and 8 Ys?
Yes.
Yeah. So for myself, I posted it in the Twitch chat as well. It's going to be twitch.tv at Brace of Otter. I am going to be playing a ranged DPS. I'm going to be playing Affliction Warlock in Shadowlands. I have never played ranged ever in my life, and I've never played a Warlock in my life. And so I feel like it's going to be good for people to kind of like go with me on this journey and feel like, oh, this is how you become a better player. Because a lot of people, I think, are going to be playing different specs and doing different things. And that's kind of a big thing, is how do you become a better player? And I'm pretty confident in myself to be able to play this class at a top tier level within about 2 to 3 weeks. So we'll see how it goes. I'm really excited for it.
All right, thanks, guys. We ask the question at the end of every show. Feel free to respond on the YouTube comments section, and if we like your response, then we'll highlight it on the next show. This week's question is, what's your favorite or least favorite aspect of Mythic Plus? Go ahead and hit us up on the YouTube comments. And that's it for us. You can find us live Friday nights at 7 p.m. PST on Twitch at twitch.tv/dsmeeps. If you want to watch later, you can find the podcast on YouTube every week on the Simply WoW podcast channel. And for audio only, you can find us on Anchor, Spotify, or Google. Just search for the Simply WoW podcast. And y'all have a wonderful night and keep it simple.
Have a good one,
guys.
guys. Bye.
See ya.